ayahuasca is a preparation made of at least two plants that are put together in a proportion that is a matter of human decision and human attention. So there isn't the ayahuasca experience. There's a whole spectrum of experiences orchestrated by human personalities that are making the decision as to whether or not to add brugmansia, brunfelsia, tryptamine, how much and in what proportion, so forth and so on. So that makes it a much more complicated dimension to explore ayahuasca than, say, peyote or mushrooms in terms of the territory you have to cover, because it's as different as the people and the regions in which it's made.
A similar question.
Isn't there the personality of the shaman himself or herself, that their energy, and if they're directing the ayahuasca journey, they bring so much of themselves with their music, with their songs.
Oh yeah, no,
it's the ceremony. It's hard to say. Well, was it the ayahuasca, the mix, or what? Which was it? Because
that's right, and their professional cachet is on the line in these groups, because they're drinking often with people who have been doing it for 30 or 40 years, near relatives, cousins, and married in-laws, and all that, and people feel quite free to critique these brews. So there's a lot of pride in how fuerte, how strong it is, and always stories of stronger brews in other times and places before modernity.
What do you see as the role between the physical pharmacology and the spirit that they feel is so important in bringing on these experiences? What do you see the relationship, or?
You mean, how does it happen that a drug can give you access to a spiritual dimension?
Well, is it just a pharmacological effect, or is it part the pharmacology and part the spirit of the thing, or is it?
Well, I think, it's not just a pharmacological effect. Somehow, what all these psychedelics really secure, I think, pretty incontrovertibly, is the formative juncture between mind and matter is somehow in the quantum chemistry of the organism. In other words, thinking, which is the glory of our species, must be, or must have on some level at least, a pharmacological component. And the materialists believe that it's entirely electrochemistry in the brain thinking. I think that will fail. That's not a sufficient explanation. But even if you believe that there is a non-physical dimension that is not rooted in matter, nevertheless somehow thinking and inner vision and ecstasy, which are neurological and neurophysiological phenomena, are somehow the operational means for accessing it when you're in a human body. So, I don't know. I think what's going to have to happen is that to account for the world of phenomena as we experience it, rather than some kind of abstract model like the atomic or molecular model, but to actually create a mature science true to experience, you're going to have to bring back, after 500, 700 years of banishment, the idea of some kind of notion of spirit. And when the shaman says spirit, we think we understand, but really shamanism uses a technical language as complicated as particle physics, and spirit is as complex a concept as spin or charm is to a quantum physicist. But somehow, and I think it's a huge transformation for science to admit an invisible, non-physical, but causally efficacious aura around things, events, objects. But really, the revolution has already begun in the 19th century with the discovery of the electromagnetic field. And the electromagnetic field, which makes possible television and FM radio and all of this stuff, was confounding to 19th century science when James Clerk Maxwell began to write the equations for these fields. I mean, they said, how can it be? How can it act over a distance without physicality? And, then they invented the ether theory to carry it through a physical medium. But then this was shown to be fallacious, and that there actually are invisible, self-sustaining electromagnetic fields vibrating at millions of hertz per second and somehow permeating all matter and potentially capable of carrying motion pictures, information, text everywhere. This is totally occult magic to the 19th century materialists. And as science, the great frontier of science is biology and the higher processes of biology culminating in thought, trying to model these things, understanding them through physical models, through dynamical system modeling. It drives the pulse of research mathematics. Nature has been rediscovered as an inspiration in certain branches of science just in the last 20 years. I mean, who would have thought that research mathematics, the most pristinely abstract of all the theoretical sciences, would generate a notion like fractals and chaos dynamics, which would then describe, population explosions, river deltas, bird migrations, the patterns on butterfly wings, and so forth and so on. And a lot of this work is done very frankly by psychedelic personalities and psychedelic imaginations. Some of you may have seen the issue of Gentleman's Quarterly about a year ago, which had this article about the psychedelic community taking the weird tack that if we suppress psychedelics, we will lose our cultural edge in the world design and technological implementation game, because this is the only edge we have over the Japanese, is our fiendish creativity created by our boiling genetic melting pot of a culture. And that if we lose that, we will end up sweeping up at McDonald's. I must digress. Why am I raving about this? Yes.
Kind of similar to your question. Sometimes I think that if you had ayahuasca and comparing taking it, at home in a dark room versus taking it with a curandero and listening to guitarras, sometimes I think you get in the same space and learn the same things, and sometimes I think that ayahuasca is like the hardware, but really that's not the interesting part. It's really the spiritual and Icaros and how the shaman moves it. What does the shaman bring to the party?
Well, in a way, it's both. I mean, in other words, taking ayahuasca at home in your room is titanically profound. It's a full-blown hallucinogenic meltdown, just like high-dose psilocybin, and the real core of it can't be told. It takes you apart so completely. On the other hand, somehow you take a day off, but then return to your desk and, horsewhipping your employees and doing whatever you have to do in daily life. If you go into what they know in the Amazon, I don't think can be told. It's below the horizon of intellectual apprehension. If you actually gave yourself to this stuff, anything is possible. I mean, I've said this for years about psilocybin, that most of spiritual questing is a frantic, full-on, full-forward scramble to attain a spark of progress. Once you get into psychedelics, you find you ride the brakes a lot more. You know now that you've got a horse you can ride. So it's not now. So now it's all about, well, do I really want this? And how much of it do I want? And if you go to the Amazon, or if you go up on Cold Mountain with a pound of mushrooms, and you can transform yourself beyond our ability to put up with you. I mean, it will just be said of you, oh yes, some woodcutters saw him 2 years ago up in the slopes, completely naked, surrounded by his elfin attendants and leaping over the rocks in the snowfield. You say, great. Is that what your mother raised you for? I don't know.
Cloud hidden whereabouts.
I mean, I think the Bodhisattvic imperative offers a great out for those of us who are chicken shit. And you can just say, oh no, I'm not ready to walk through the violet doorway yet. I must yet labor here on the other side for a few moments more. And same thing in the Amazon. I mean, they say, la selva es como un sueño. The forest is like a dream. The forest is like a dream. You realize that, you, the ingénu, the questing fool, the child of God, have somehow gotten your dominoes arranged this time so that it's actually going to work. And then you descend one of these rivers into a Venusian world of, iridescent blue butterflies the size of pie plates and scheming shaman and and somehow the boundaries of that are held in place. I think it's something about how when we aggregate socially, there's something like a collective cultural vision that we're living in, breathing in, dressing in all the time, and that it keeps us from flipping out, basically, into the undigested pre-linguistic chaos of the who knows what right around the corner. Well, so then if you go into wilderness, this is the classic thing, and then you perturb your categories with hallucinogens and, see the syntactical machinery melt down and understand the relativity of language and all this stuff, then there's just an incredibly bewildering swarm of possibilities which rush in to fill this newly created intellectual vacuum. And most of it is magical and referential and symbolical and runs on the dynamic of magic rather than the dynamic of the casuistry of European positivism. And you think you're losing your marbles, and by our standards, you are losing your marbles. And then the question is, this truth that is beginning to poke through, how much of it can be integrated, and how controllable is it, and what is its ultimate implication? I mean, it gets very peculiar. It's, This is, whatever else it is, these psychedelics are certainly a tool for unlocking the labyrinthine peculiarities of the imagination.
So do you think you were talking about Maxwell's equations and how that magic turned into technology. Do you think we'll do that with psychedelics? In 20 years, we'll have it really kind of there'll be some equations and some understanding of, not of the chemistry, but of the
well, I would be the last person to sell short the imagination of the human species at the close of the second millennium. I mean, I think we're poised for some kind of leap. It's not clear what it is. I mean, everybody has their dog and pony show, the nanotechnologists, the space colony people, the super drug people, my millennial meltdown theory is in there sharp-elbowed, and because there's a sense, I didn't intend to talk about this, but it's sort of maybe worth talking about as we approach the ethnopharmacological thing embedded in the larger context of biology and nature. One of the things that I've learned from psychedelics that just seems self-evident to me now is this thing about how complexity, how the universe is an engine for the conservation of complexity or novelty, that from the very first moment of the Big Bang, processes have become the foundations for yet more complex and integrated processes which built on these more primitive processes, so that, the universe is born in an enormously hot plasma where it's just a soup of free electrons, basically. There aren't even atomic systems, let alone molecules or anything like that. And as the universe cools, basically, more and more complex forms of order appear, freezing out, as it were, crystallizing out of this mix. Well, not only is this happening, but it's also happening in such a way that each phase comes more quickly than the phase that preceded it. So, you have the era in the life of the universe when it was all physics, and stars were cooking out heavy elements and stuff like that, and supernovas were churning and galaxies were condensing. But then, once some of these heavy elements are cooked out, including carbon, you get a whole new kind of chemistry based on the four-valent properties of carbon. And so you get polymerization, long-chain molecules, the possibility now of something like DNA, and you get molecular aggregates, proto-proteins, and these sorts of things. Well, then, out of these simple building blocks, membranes and transfer systems and decoupling systems and all these things arise, and from them proceeds more complex forms of life, and out of that, thinking of like prokaryotes and like that, then you get forms of largely asexual reproduction. And then sexuality is invented as an obvious ploy to speed up the shuffling of the genetic deck. Well, if you carry this analysis of natural dynamics far enough, what you discover then is that human civilization is not some viral bad trip off on the periphery of things, but it actually begins to look like it's building on all these other levels of complexity. It's somehow purposeful. It has a telos that is imparted to it from nature, and yet it's also like a trigger phenomenon because it's so brief. Upon the condensation of the planet and the circulation of the continents is established the slow evolution of species, but upon that comes this ephemeral iridescence of culture that, generously is 25,000 years old in any recognizable form other than sitting around chipping flint, 25,000 years in biology is, doesn't even, you blink and you missed it. And yet, in that moment, information, and that was my point, that in this process of the conservation of novelty seems to be like the physical expression of information existing in some kind of symbolic space. I mean, doesn't mean hyperspace, it just means a syntactical space, a dimensional dimension of meaning congruent to ordinary experience. Well,
the derivative?
Something like that.
The change might be the derivative, or the novelty might be the derivative of the change.
Well, technology is like the visible condensation of language. And so our species, what this process of neurological activity driven by psilocybin or driven by whatever seems to be about is the excretion of ideas. Not, most animal forms lay an egg, spin a web, dig a hole. We have put in place some kind of omni-adaptable design process where they had a single gene for behavior or a set of genes. And so then what we do is we make ideas. And this process has become more and more accelerated over time because one idea synergizes another. And we've essentially migrated inside a realm of ideas, much in the same way that the social insects migrated into a pheromonal social structure. And we're living now inside these ideas. I mean, some of them are physical ideas like automobiles and subways, but most of them are ideological constructs like filial obligation, monogamy, capitalism, shamanism. I mean, there's no moral judgment on this. This is just what we do. And somehow these powerful hallucinogens, I mean, I think the essence of shamanism, in a sense, is that wherever you start from in that process, you find your way through the use of extraordinary physical techniques or ordeals or hallucinogens behind the appearances of things. That the cultural machinery of language, you make the Wizard of Oz discovery, you say, it's just a little man pulling levers back here. And this gives the shaman power to reweave the structure of reality where it has become damaged. And disease in that cosmology is something like that. It's an unraveling in the weaving of the reality, and it can be fixed by song and magic, because language and song and magic are what are holding the world in place. A friend of mine once, upon smoking DMT and being interviewed after coming down, said that in every angle of the room he had seen a tiny demon doing calisthenics. And he said he believed that these demons were keeping the world from folding up into a line, that just they hold open every 90-degree angle. They're the demon of the angles, and without them the whole thing would just become terribly humdrum.
Is that what you mean by magic? Or what when you use the term magic, what is you mean by that?
I mean some kind of, Jung called it psychoid, I'm not sure why exactly, but an entry into a dimension where two possibilities are happening. Either the level of synchronicity is so high that the fiction of statistical probability breaks down completely. I mean, where, just what's going on is so improbable that it can't simply be called improbable. It's miraculous. And then the other dimension to the magic is the migration of spirit into matter and the co-fusion of the opposites. I mean, what magic is about is somehow overcoming the dualism of the phonetic language heritage of Greece, overcoming that and having the subject-object dualism drop away and actually seeing how things are composed of their complete antecedents. This is what alchemy is all about, they call it the coincidentia oppositorum, the union of opposites. And it's a completely legitimate intellectual move. In quantum physics now, you have to use what's called a Boolean algebra. And the vision of the quantum realm now is a realm of ordinary logic out of which protrude these areas which are called isles of Boole. And they're places where you get to change the rule and you get to use a both-and logic instead of an either-or logic. And that's what Boolean algebra is working out the consequences of a both-and logic. So if it's legitimate at the quantum mechanical level, we started out this discussion by saying what psychedelics secure is somehow the union of mind and matter at that level. So, and I don't understand how this works, this magical domain. When the rational mind is present, it doesn't work. But it turns out the rational mind is just a psychoid object in your personality. And you can trick it into non-existence, either by overwhelming it with a psychedelic. But even when you're like on a psychedelic and waiting expectantly for it to manifest, until your quote-unquote attention wanders, it won't show. It's because this thing which we call our attention is this thing which is holding the laws of Newtonian physics and casuistry somehow in place. I mean, I don't pretend to understand all this. Clearly, if one did understand all this, you could untie the knot and somehow, you would be a real shaman. I mean, you would be able to pass in and out of ordinary states of existence and move through these dimensions. They're there, but for most of us, they seem to be accessible only in the imagination. And then the imagination invites close inspection and attention. And what is the imagination? Essentially, the psychedelics are imagination catalysts. That's the human faculty which they work on, especially the visual imagination. Well, again, we have so imbibed the assumptions of positivism that most people think the imagination is like the mind idling, and they think of the mind as the electrochemical activity of the brain. But, the phenomenon of memory poses certain problems for that model of how it all works, because it's said, that we change all of our physical material except our neurons every 5 to 10 years. Well, how then can a 70-year-old person remember the smell of their grandmother's parlor when they were age 6? 10 times in the course of life, all matter has been replaced. Well, then where are the memories? And how can a memory of a spring day 70 years in the past be just present? This is a great mystery that the materialists prefer not really to look at. And what it implies is that, mind is not something in the brain, that the brain is like a quantum mechanical transducer of some sort. It's a receiver, not a generator of mind. And that mind is like the co-presence of everything in a higher dimensional space, which, if there were a kind of hyperspace lying behind nature, then everything would be co-present there. I mean, it's just a mathematical fact of the matter, no mumbo-jumbo about it. That's what that means. All points cotangent on the next level up. So, I think the reason I'm so stoked on psychedelics is because, in spite of the fact that they're archaic and that people have been doing this for 100,000 years, still I think it's always been the cutting edge. That really what shamanism means is, in some languages, the word means go-between. The shamans go between ordinary reality and something else, a kind of platonic superspace where the future and the past and other declensions of possibility are all visible. And it's a mystery of neurophysiology and psychochemistry and brain architecture and mathematical complexity and chaos dynamics. But it's not, in principle, beyond rational apprehension. It can be understood, and it can be made the basis of who knows what. I mean, it's a technology of the imagination, of building in a world where human freedom could exfoliate itself in ways that are inconceivable or destructive if you're trying to live in three-dimensional space on the surface of a very fragile planet with a whole bunch of other folks also trying to hang on.
Where do the ancestors fit into all this? If we're at the culmination point and we're getting a lot of pressure from the ancestors, and a lot of people, probably white people, wouldn't be aware of this because it hasn't been a cultural imperative of ours to talk about this. And yet, shamanic people seem to think that this is a pretty important thing.
Well, if you believe that there's no getting off the track, that nothing has gone wrong, then it must be that somehow this certain tribe, this certain group of tribes in Northern Europe, the Indo-Europeans, the wheel makers, the horse breakers, these people were like the prodigal sons and somehow fell out of archaic existence and were led on a long, strange trip into history, basically, into monotheism, into the Greek ideal of nature. I mean, when you think about a torso from the classic Greek period, a human torso, and the other forms of art being created in the world at that time, everyone else were symbolists of some sort. They carved, they distorted. Only the Greeks broke through to what it is, this amazing understanding of realism. And from that led to this peculiar form of engagement with nature called science. And so if you believe that everything is on track, then probably there was some reason for the descent into history. And that in the same way that you can see history as like a psychedelic trip of some sort, it's also like a shamanic journey. It's a journey past many, many concentric circles guarded by demons. I mean, first, the Roman Empire, then the Dark Ages, then the High Gothic, then the Baroque, then the Industrial Reformation. So weirder and weirder and weirder. And apparently the Holy Grail, it's hard to say what it is. Is it the ability to release an incredible amount of energy in a short time? In which case we've arrived in the parking pattern, because we now can, blow the planet to bits like a stick of dynamite in a rotten apple, basically. So if that was what it was about, we're there. Maybe it was something else. The complete sequencing of the human genome and the ability to completely manipulate the palette of genetic material in order to redesign ourselves out of history. This is possible. This is now within reach. I mean, we could conceive of a future where somehow we did something with ourselves that left us unrecognizable to ourselves. I mean, I spoke yesterday of how the mushroom was like a designed organism. Well, how far could you go with that, I mean, could we create a planet where every eye that looked out at that world was a conscious eye with a thinking, judging mind behind it, from, sea slug to squirrel monkey, somebody you once knew, or, some more exotic virtual reality, nanotechnology, hybrid kind of thing where everybody gets downloaded into a super cooled cube of gold ytterbium alloy buried at the bottom of Copernicus and goes off into virtual heaven or something like that. I mean, believe me, Fujitsu is trying to bring it to you. There are folks working on all these frontiers.
Wouldn't some sort of ultimate thing have to be transplanted off of our particular neighborhood and solar system and off?
Well, this was hot a while ago. It seems ultimately you would think so, but also it seems that we've hit sort of a technological problem here. I mean, the problem to go to Jupiter compared to the problem to go to Alpha Centauri is like the difference between hollowing out a tree trunk to make a canoe and building the Queen Mary or something. Well, yes, but again, hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity. If there is a parallel continuum, then shamans should probably, the shamans in the Amazon say they go to the Milky Way. I mean, they say many, many things. They seem to access a stratified cosmos, a cosmos of levels. And, I think if you're a true lover of the weird, you will be able to find a doorway out. It may not take you to, the third star in the Zenebel-Ganubi system, but it'll take you far enough that you'll end up begging for mercy, probably.
There's a technical imperative sort of going on in the technology today to create sort of a Noah's Ark kind of a spaceship with genetic information on it that's going to shoot this thing out into space like a big seed. This is one of the things that's going on. And do you think this is like one of our cultural imperatives that's coming from our great history of pioneering or whatever that is?
Well, sort of. I mean, I think, this metaphor I mentioned earlier about the novelty and how each epic follows more quickly upon the other. I think an idea like an archival ship like that, or a flying saucer, or what these things are like ahead of us. This technology process has a foreseeable end. You can imagine the tool, the final tool, a union of human intentionality and spirit as matter, something like, but a little less menacing than the material, the Terminator, was made out of. In other words, alchemical gold. And if you are hungry, you eat it. And if you need to go somewhere, you stretch it out and sit on it, and it flies. And if you need to know something, you ask it. And what it really is, and what technology is the process of doing, I think, is it's the human soul externalized. Somehow what history is about is turning ourselves inside out. And this technological excrescences that are our hallmark are an effort to condense the mind that we sense within ourselves before ourselves as a kind of obedient, reflective, ectoplasmic slave of some sort that is the perfection of life in three-dimensional space. Why we have this idea is not clear, but this is what lies behind, we talked about this some last week, these magical phlegms in the Amazon, which these ayahuasqueros vomit out, these ultraviolet plasmic fluids that when you spread them out on the ground and look into them, there are stars in there. And, you know, what it is it's a hyperdimensional membrane, or, you know, something on the border between metaphor and reality that is activated in the psychedelic state by these totally apeshit ayahuasqueros to then objectify their power and their ability to melt through the dimensions and make big magic. Yeah.
Excuse me. Where does the heart play in all of this?
Well, it plays the role that it's always playing. It's going to be itself to pieces. In other words, it's going to look like the end of the world. More and more, it is looking like the end of the world. But the metaphor, you know, that seems to have the heart thing in it and to put it across to people is to say that it's like a birth. If you had never seen someone give birth and you came around a corner and were confronted with this phenomenon, it reeks of medical emergency. You know, there's moaning and groaning and blood is being shed and people are thrashing around, and it's so then you would conclude there was a problem. It would take a real leap of faith to embrace this as a wonderful occasion and a great natural step forward. And that's the planetary situation that we're in. I mean, we're in the birth canal of a new ontological order for mankind. And, you know, the cheerful amniotic oceans of a planetary past with an endless frontier and endless exploitable resources and mineral wealth and all that, that's all gone now. Now, the walls are closing in. We're suffocating, we're strangling, and we're being massaged toward we don't know what. The end of the world is all anybody can think. Well, imagine a fetus trying to anticipate his future career as stockbroker or Indian chief from the point of view of the birth canal. I mean, it just means that this phase of the career of intelligence on this planet is closing. Why shouldn't it be brief? It has been so brief all along. Processes have been happening faster and faster. Why should we have supposed that we would be exempt from this rule of accelerating process? So we're being carried into, something is summoning us into its presence and sculpting us as we approach it into what it wants us to be. And it's weird.
Terence, isn't it in the birth process that the brain is flooded with DMT?
Do I recall that correctly?
Somebody else asked about this, and then we got into a discussion about how could anybody have ever found that out.
I don't know.
I don't think so.
No?
Well, I just don't think you would ever do that kind of human research and get away with it. So I think it's probably apocryphal. But I urge you to repeat it.
Okay.
Anyway.
Terence, how do you explain the decline of the hallucinogenic societies like the ones we saw in the slides last night that created those statues?
You mean,
in your opinion, weren't they able to persist like our technological society has and be a dominant factor in today's reality?
you mean the Maya? And well, it's a big question. I mean, we're all enthusiasts of hallucinogens, so we prefer to assume that the Mayan religion was built on this and so forth and so on. The evidence is highly controversial for exactly what was going on. They may well have. Certainly, if you look at the funerary vases that Francis Robesek published in that book of his called The Maya Book of the Dead, a reconstruction of a ceramic codex, the weirdness of these encounters between these royal members of the royal line and these entities coming up out of these plumes of columns of smoke certainly look like a DMT cult. But I think probably the Mayan civilization, as the decipherment now makes more and more clear, was a very, very highly stratified society with a very steep social pyramid, and the poetry recitations and the cultivation of exaggerated social forms and all that make it seem sort of like Nakamura, Japan, which was a similar kind of society and very warlike and very ritualized and very stylized. And I think probably as the decipherment proceeds of the various theories of the Mayan collapse that will have been advanced over the years, probably the notion of what's called the slave revolt theory, that finally the lower classes just weren't having it, and began a generational period of social upheaval that began at Copan and radiated outward and ended the massive building phase and the long count, the erection of long count stela.
So the underclasses were denied the use of hallucinogens?
I can't imagine that they wouldn't have been, because I imagine these things were the province of this poetically inclined nobility. There's no evidence either way. I just don't feel that...
Just confused how hierarchy and territoriality, warlikeness fits into the equation when you said in an earlier discussion that these hallucinogens break through those boundaries.
No, I understand the question. The problem is we have no idea how shaped by hallucinogens the Mayan society was. For instance, it might have been the province of a shamanic lodge, like the Masons or something. Well, then most people would have known nothing about it. In many societies, hallucinogens are institutionalized as secret societies, like at Eleusis and ayahuasca men's groups in the Amazon and so forth.
Or our own culture.
Or our own culture. Yeah.
One aspect is for the heart connection that is a part of my dream. If the success is in the externalization of the soul, and you have this magic carpet or whatever, I would just suggest that the word slave, I would replace it with lover.
Or, yeah, that's better. Or self, even. It is yourself. I mean, it's like you've given birth to the eternal portion of yourself.
It seems to me that when I take psychedelics, that what it does for me is intensifies my compassion and my insight and handshakes the imagination. I mean, the imagination is incredible, but it's even intensified with a surge and activation of compassion and insight. Do you find that part of the experience? Is that a point of view?
You mean that you feel connected up to everybody and compassionate?
Yes, and there's an honoring, there's more of an honoring of differences without conflict, which in normal reality, conflict becomes the issue. So for me, it's my lesson of honoring differences without conflict, and enhanced with compassion and insight.
Yeah, well, it
That's
certainly is a dose of
it
difference.
teaches me that lesson more and more. But is that a point of view that? I mean, is that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's tremendously humbling, and that the complexity and it's so rich. It's the richest thing there is. I mean, and to discover it inside yourself is so surprising and affirming. I mean, life would be 50% less interesting if there were no psychedelics. I mean, imagine if as loaded as you could get in this world was 3 gin tonics or something. I mean, that would be something. No, I think that it's where you see the mystery, whatever it is, and it can't be said what it is because it's a true mystery. You know, it's the surface of the logos. It's I don't know, the ontological authenticity that lies behind being visibly beheld. I mean, it's amazing. Yeah.
There are peoples in the world who live in places where they do not have hallucinogens or entheogens, and I find it kind of comforting, actually, that people can live all sorts of different ways and come to surprisingly the same conclusions and are able to live fine, and I just kind of like to keep that perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder what they do, how they get off.
Living much more with naturally inside yourself, and you don't need to bring it in from outside.
Well, or there could be, genetic lines where there's a restlessness that is not present in other peoples. I mean, some people are very happy where they are. The mushroom, in fact, said to me one time, I memorized it, I've never yet understood it. It said, the pygmies will be singing in the rainforests when the Celts storm our tourists. Thank you. What?
My view of the Mayan experience was that the Mayan people, there wasn't any separation between them and their environment at all. They were living a story. They were a live story, and that the mushroom was used as a discovery for linear thinking, which was in part how they built their greatness, which was kind of evident, by the way, in the 1850 or whenever it was, when the Mayan people in Yucatan were on the verge of victory in their rebellion. When the day to plant corn came around their calendar, all the warriors walked home to plant the corn.
That's right. They walked away from certain victory in this war they'd fought for years in order to plant the corn.
So perhaps the mushroom was used by the Mayans it was a discovery of linear thinking.
It could be. If you're interested, I mean, this is a fascinating question. There's a great book called The Dynamics of Apocalypse, Computer Modeling the Classic Maya Collapse. And it goes over the many, many theories and tries to reach some conclusions, which it really doesn't, but it's a fascinating thing. something very good or something very bad happened, because they moved for over 1,000 years in a certain direction and built up an urban civilization in the rainforest that nobody except at Angkor Wat in Cambodia had done that. And at the apex of this cultural efflorescence, packed it in fairly quickly. And the Mayan language group is the largest language group in the Americas. 15 million people speak a dialect of Maya. There are 15 living dialects of it. So it's not a question of where did they go. They didn't go anywhere. They just backed out on a whole civilization, and they became instead small tropical farmers, as they had been 1,500 years previously. Very peculiar, very interesting.
Terence, were they big people, do you know?
I don't think they were particularly big.
Huh?
No,
Because when we went to Palenque, the steps, I mean, it was really it was an exercise for me, and we did this for 3 days. I got my set of exercise, but I can't believe they did this.
Well, they just had you have to realize that it's clear they had a different sense of architecture, because here you build this enormous temple, like the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, and then what happens is 12 guys can stand around on top of it somewhat uncomfortably, and that's this skyscraper. So, because, they had no interiors, really. They built, every 52 years, they would recover the temples with more stone and build them progressively higher and higher, which was a great break for Mayan archaeology, because you can just peel these things like an onion and go back and back and back.
But they did go up and down the steps,
I
didn't
think
they?
the size of the steps may have had more to do with the number of steps, that they weren't fitting into a particular space, than it did to do with the size of people.
Mm-hmm.
I
still don't know how they went up and down the steps.
Yeah, but somebody
Puffing and puffing.
I mean, if the Earth is still around in who knows how long, somebody might find a Frank Lloyd Wright building too, and figure, well, how did these people go up and down these stairs?
I'd like to go back to Robert's question. It seems very difficult to believe that if anybody, any large group of people in the Mayan culture were using psychedelics on a regular basis, there would be that kind of hierarchy and oppression of large groups of people. I just find that, I don't know if there's any explanation, I just find it hard to believe. They don't fit.
Well, we don't know if either was the case. In other words, we don't know, no Mayan depiction of mushroom use or morning glory use survives. What we have are the mushroom stones, although there was an elaborate paper published by somebody at Harvard saying these mushroom stones are not mushroom stones at all, and demonstrated that you could take a piece of wild rubber and sit with this stone between your knees and pound it out in a certain way and make cuts on it in a certain way, and could make a perfect rubber ball. And so it said, these are essentially lasts. Isn't that what they're called, that you hammer something on? These are lasts for making balls, and you're just crazy to think that so there's that theory. There's no, that smoking god that some people have on their T-shirts here at Palenque is the only depiction in stone of the use of tobacco ever found. Tobacco was important, clearly. It's depicted in the vase paintings. Francis Robesek did a book called Tobacco, the Smoking Gods, that's all about the Maya. But it's impossible really to know how Mayan society worked at this point. Well, if you look at Robesek's book, I think you can satisfy yourself that it probably is smoking, because he shows enough of these counterexamples off these other ceramics that it looks like a style. It's something. They have these horrific depictions of these dragon-like creatures vomiting other entities that rise up out of these what look like incense pots or something. And, you know, some of us might like to believe that they're heaving DMT resin onto hot coals and breathing it in. Something like that. But we don't know enough about hallucinogen use. And the mushroom complex, of course, is in the Sierra Mazateca. That doesn't involve Maya. That's Mixtec and Mazatec Indians, the people whose ancestors built Monte Alban. If you should go to Oaxaca, there's an immense city there, 3,500 years of continuous occupation on these two flattened mountaintops called Monte Alban. That's one of the most amazing sites in the Americas. And it's not Mayan at all. It's Mixtec, Mazatec, and like that. And that's where the mushroom thing, we assume, held sway for a long time, because that's where it was found intact in the 50s.
What was their society like? Was it stratified?
I don't know how much is known about the Monte Alban people. They, I'm not sure that they had writing. I'm not sure about that. Later, there were Mixtec codices. For instance, the Codex Vindobonensis Mexicanus I that Jonathan showed slides of last night, that shows people, remember, it showed the people holding mushrooms, and it showed the glyph for the psychedelic experience with the guy diving down through. That is a Mixtec codex, Vindobonensis I. It's not a Mayan codex. So conclusions about mushroom use in the Mayan area can't really be drawn from that.
The design of some of these buildings, when you look at them from above, is suggestive, it's highly suggestive of all kinds of infrastructural patterns of possibly states of mind also.
I think it was a very stone society at the top. This question about how can you have a hierarchical society and a psychedelic, we forget the all-pervasive impact of modern media. For instance, the answer to that question is you have it in the form of a secret society or a mystery cult.
But if it's all over the cow dung, how can it stay a secret?
Oh, well, no. The Stropharia cubensis mushroom entered the New World with the Spanish. So what I was going to talk about, or what it made me think of, is the Soma cult of the Indo-Europeans. The great mystery here, you see, is you get these endlessly verbose poems, the Rig Vedas, singing the praises of Soma. Well, then, number one, what is it? And number two, if it was so wonderful, how could it have ever died out? And that's an interesting question. How can a plant or a drug be found and lost? And how often does that happen culturally? And how can it happen if it inspires 135,000 lines of ecstatic poetry chiseled on stone or something? Then how can it ever be lost? Well, the only scenario that I can concoct is that it must belong to an elite, and they initiate people into it, and if you're not in the club, you don't know about it. And then what happens is the lower classes, the classes that are supporting this social pyramid, get pissed off, and they kill the elite. And in the process of exterminating a priestly class or a ruling class, a sacrament of a secret men's society could easily be completely trampled underfoot and forgotten.
For Soma, it started in kind of above where India is now, where some plants might have grown, where some might have grown, and then they migrated south into India with a very different climate, and then they couldn't grow the plant.
Well, in my book, Food of the Gods, I spend a fair bit of time on this because it's an interesting question and a lot of people have tried to figure it out. I think that, first of all, it was a process which took a long time. We're talking several millennia of time for these things to happen. What happened was, north of Lake Van, in the grasslands on the Caspian Sea, these Indo-European tribes discovered the wheel. And at this time, they were domesticating the horse for the first time. And they created a new kind of social invention, which was not the nomadism of the pedestrian nomad following his herds, but a nomadism based on mounted horsemen and plunder and rape, and the extension of social boundaries by force over vast areas. So these were the Indo-Europeans, the people who may have taken Amanita muscaria, who practiced a rite of horse sacrifice, and so forth and so on. They came down around 6500 BC. They entered Asia Minor, the Anatolian plain of Turkey, and destroyed Çatalhöyük, which was this other kind of civilization, a mother goddess, matriarchal, psychedelic, cattle-based, horned goddess civilization that had built the most advanced city in the world of that time, was there on the Anatolian plain, had gone through several cultural efflorescences and retrenchments, and then was destroyed in 6500 BC by these people, the Indo-Europeans. And I think they, over time, accepted the mushroom of these pastoral valley people that they conquered as they swept across Anatolia and then ran and into India. And it took 1,000 or more years for this process to happen. And the Vedas were written during this period of time. It's very hard, if you think Soma is Amanita muscaria, to explain the cattle imagery, because cattle have nothing whatsoever to do with Amanita muscaria. Also, Amanita muscaria is a hard-to-obtain, high-altitude endemic at that latitude, and the Rig Veda speaks of daily pressings of Soma to serve hundreds of initiates. So where would you have gotten these amounts of Amanita muscaria? So I think probably it was psilocybin, and then later psilocybin mushroom probably combined with Pergamon harmala. You see, parallel to the development of the Vedas in that area was the development of the Zoroastrian religion, and it had a literature called the Avestas, and they spoke in extravagant terms about a magical sacrament called Hauma. Well, Hauma and Soma are the same word. So, and the Hauma of Zoroastrianism has always been known to be Pergamon harmala. If any of you are experimenting with Pergamon harmala and you want to know the history of this plant, you should get this book, a wonderful book called Hauma and Harmaline by Flattery and Schwartz. It's a publication of the Near Eastern Studies Department of the University of California at Berkeley. And one of the things you learn there that's amazing is that this Zoroastrian, or what was called Zurvanism, the religion of Iran that preceded Zoroaster, that he in fact reformed, Zurvanism, which was the worship of eternity, the only method they recognized for the attaining of spiritual information was pharmacological. They said they had this notion of a realm, I can't remember what it was called. Among Mandayans it's called Musunya Kashta. But they said, the only way you can find out about Musunya Kashta is to take Haoma. No other way. Good works, prayer, lives of ascetic, rectitude, forget it. Only Haoma can show you Meshunya Kashta. So, huh?
Who were these people?
pre-Zoroastrian practitioners of Zurvanism on the plain of Iran and Iraq.
Was the homa mixed with something, or just as plain?
It was, no, it seems like it was probably, see, this is an interesting point. It's good you brought this up. I think in our circle, we tend to dismiss harmaline because we're familiar with harmine from Banisteriopsis caapi, and harmine is an efficient MAO inhibitor, but not an efficient hallucinogen until you get close to toxic doses. Harmaline, on the other hand, has a somewhat different pharmacological profile, and it's possible that harmaline alone in doses of like 200 milligrams is sufficiently hallucinogenic that you could actually lay the basis for some kind of ritual use with that alone. I mean, it's also possible, and this is a great area for scholarship and long, loaded arguments, that there are DMT sources in the ancient Middle East and India that could have been added into the Soma. The one that interests me the most, because I think it's very suggestive, and you could actually probably squeeze a book out of this subject, is there's a plant called a Rundodonax. Some of you may know about it, that is the giant river reed of the Middle East. To this day, this plant is the source of reeds for wind instruments, fine woodwind instruments. Well, the roots contain DMT, and when you look back at the ancient stratum of Hellenic religion, there is this phenomenon called Orphism, or the myth of Orpheus. And Orpheus was a flute player, flute, and he descends into the underworld to try and, through the roots of a tree, to try and rescue his lover. And Orphic religion was the parallel mystery religion to the Eleusinian cults and the cult at Delphi, and it was very old and, very secret. So it's possible that a Rundodonax and Pergamon harmala would yield an interesting...
Say that again. You spell it?
Arundo, Donax, Donax. It's a plant that in the Central Valley of California is such a problem, it clogs the canals, and they go through with big machines and heave up great dripping masses of it beside these canals, and one could presumably go there and scrape to your heart's content.
The root bark or the whole...
My understanding is it's the root bark, but I'm not sure. It's, again, those cheesy chemists, Bratterjee, Gosal, and Ranji, a paper in 1972 in Lloydia. Arundodonax.
Dude, have you experimented with harmaline?
By itself? No, that would be very interesting to do. Have you done that?
No.
Yeah, I think probably it may be underrated. In any case, this book by Flattery and Schwartz, Haoma and Harmaline, is just a wealth of information and attacks this Wasson theory about Amanita muscaria, which I think is weaker than people suppose and long overdue.
Jonathan has a counterattack.
Oh, no, well, Jonathan is a great defender of Wasson, and Wasson has many defenders, but I think that theory requires revision. See, what I brought to the argument that was new was the whole notion that Africa and African species could have played a role in this, and that far from the Indo-Europeans carrying Amanita muscaria cults into a mushroomless Anatolia, that what they found there were cultures with roots in Africa that had been mycophilic for millennia. And people just underestimated the potential role of the Saharan ecosystem in this whole equation, but obviously that's where the ungulate animals were, and so that's where the mushrooms evolved that were particular to the ungulates. and where the cattle went, the mushroom went, and where the cattle went, a certain cultural style went that now can be seen to be, this prototypic archaic style. And then my interpretation of like hallucinogenic drug cults in the New World was that people adapting to these kinds of complex environments found their way back to an archaic style in the same way that we did. I mean, here's an interpretation on the Mayan use of mushrooms. They did use mushrooms, and so they pulled the plug on the civilization. In other words, the mushroom using may have come at the late phase, and then people just said, enough of calculating these long count dates and chiseling them onto limestone. This is nuts. We should go make whoopee in the forest and brew palm beer.
The question of Soma, I think, is really interesting. It seems to me that psychedelics and all these things access are like an archaic, paleolithic state of mind, like you say.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe Soma wasn't an access to an archaic state of mind, but a plant extract of some sort that brought people out of an archaic state of mind, think of alcohol. It could somehow explain their violence or goddess destroying it and poetic and ego-centered behavior.
That's an interesting suggestion. Heinrich Zimmer, who's the great art historian commentator on Hindu culture and psychology, he says in the opening to his book, The Art of India and Asia, something like, the Vedic religious breakthrough was that they overcame the sacrality of space. He said these people had no sacred rivers, no sacred waterfalls, no consecrated boulders. They would kindle a cosmic fire. And where that fire was kindled, there the center of their cosmos would come to rest. So they transcended the idea of geography, and where they built their fire of sacrifice, that was the axis mundi of their universe. It's an extraordinary leap into abstraction. It was from fiddling around with wheels that they got into this, you see. It could well be. That's an interesting speculation. The Vedic pantheon is not terribly attractive, I find. But
also, there's always spoken of
a golden liquid.
So,
yes, and harmaline would certainly give you, if you, at an industrial level, were extracting harmaline from Pagaman harmala, it would be a golden yellow liquid. Well, that's very interesting. The cereal grasses are monocots, and they're among the most recently evolved plants and are genetically highly variable, so that races of cereals come and go with fair regularity. They did an experiment in California a few years ago where they went to one of the oldest missions in California, where they had used cereal straw as the binder in the adobe bricks, and they very carefully dissolved these bricks with strong acidic solutions, and they cataloged a number of cereal grains that are now extinct, including a form of rice with a kernel twice the size of any modern kernel of rice, so forth and so on. The point I want to make with regard to Soma is it's occurred to me that, and I've never heard this discussed by anybody, that when you're told what not to eat, when you're on an MAO inhibitor, always close to the top of the list is lentils. Well, this Indo-European area is lentil land. It's the land of dal. I mean, the first thing you hear in the morning when you get up in India is dal. You're having dal, and there are many different races and kinds of dal. Well, is it possible that what we're dealing with is a nutritional predisposition to a much stronger reaction to harmaline than, say, a white bread-eating North Hollywood population would display, or something like that. This is possible that ancient diets were much more restricted than modern diets, and people could have had sensitivities and cultural habituations built in that gave them exotic blood chemistries and so forth that made them more responsive to these things. Certainly in the Amazon, when you go days eating nothing but yucca, Manihot esculenta, and farinha and coca, and that's it, and then you take ayahuasca or psilocybin or something, it can really get right at you, because you're not carrying a lot of preservatives and weird nutritional static. You're honed to the bone, and you can imagine the people who are out there for years on those kinds of diets, what a sensitive assay system they're running for these things. Yeah.
What do you think about the model of the universe as a holographic universe?
Well, I sort of veered in that direction this morning when I talked about how the mind is a receiver, not a generator of the phenomenon of consciousness. Yeah, I think that somehow it's hard for me to believe that it's hard to build a material model of memory, and it's sort of hard to build an immaterial model of memory. Memories are so specific, it's hard to see how you can code them into cold air. On the other hand, there are so many of them, and what you see when you take hallucinogens is just this Niagara of visual data. Well, where is this stuff coming from? Where is it stored? Is it being generated in real time, a millisecond before you behold it? Or is it like a film being played? So I think some kind of high-density information storage in some kind of superspace is implied. Even the straight people in physics now require the most popular model of cosmology at the moment requires 11 dimensions of description. There are the 3 spatial dimensions, the temporal dimension, and then 6 other dimensions that are folded in at the microphysical level. So, and that's physics, the bedrock of our worldview. These are supposedly the most secure knowledge that we Westerners have is in the realm of physics. Well, then you start asking for a recitation of this secure knowledge, and you discover it reads like a fairy tale from hell, virtual particles and violations of physics and exotic forms of logic and action at a distance and instantaneous transmission of information, all these paradoxes ricocheting around. What has happened is that science has prosecuted its program for the explanation of nature to the point where the non-rational basis of nature is now there to behold, which means, you almost have to be pushed back to a mystical position. Tertullian said of Christianity, they asked him, the resurrection, it's ridiculous, it doesn't make any sense, how can you believe this stuff? And he said, credo te absurdum, I believe it because it's absurd. And this is sort of where quantum physics is now. Yeah.
A little bit on this memory and storage stuff. I've heard bits and pieces, but I don't know anything. I'm just wondering if you have any knowledge of these crystal skulls, and there's all kinds of theories of communication and knowledge storage and things in those.
Well, I've read a little bit about the crystal skulls. It is a very mysterious and finely wrought object. The rigidity of the categories of the people into whose clutches it fell might require revising and strengthening. The problem with so much occult thinking is that it's just they never encountered the notion of the rules of evidence. The rules of evidence. In fact, the New Age generally suffers from this problem. Not only the New Age, but a number of points of view. I mean, Marxism, Freudianism, every point of view, every philosophy, the tough question you should ask somebody if they say, I'm a Scientologist, or I'm a Ayn Randian, or something. The question to ask is, under what circumstances would you abandon your major premise? And if you say this to a Marxist, they will never answer you. Neither will a Freudian. And usually neither will the devotees of the fall of Lemuria.
I might add, neither would the Warani.
Neither would the Warani.
Because after working with them for about 3 years, I sort of realized that they have this, I don't know, they didn't say this or anything, but it kind of seems like since I have no explanation for anything, everything is possible. And they were telling me about a guy, him who died like 30 years ago, and he was able to jump like over rivers and just hundreds of feet, just jump up. When someone would come and attack his house at night, he'd be able to jump up through the roof of his house. And they all told me about him. And that's just one of the many.
It's a rubbery language, so it permits these things, If you learned it, you could probably jump 30 feet, too. Well, there are a number of technologies being developed and pushed that probably wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for all the LSD people took in the 60s, because the people who dreamed them up, oh wow phase, and has sort of settled down to putting together decent hardware. Nanotechnology, you all know what this is, right?
I know.
Nanotechnology is this idea that is really gaining strength, that machines should be designed from the atomic level upward. So these people are creating techniques for building really eensy-beensy machines. I mean, these are the guys who can get 16 electric motors inside a human hair. And, that's just the beginning. I mean, they envision a world of programmable micro machines like viruses, which, if you have something wrong with you, you just inject these things into your body and they ream out the cholesterol in your arteries, and they build houses, and all objects are manufactured by swarms of these things, and so forth and so on. And it is interesting, the micro-physical realm. This would be one escape for us and our cultural dilemma. Some of you may know a wonderful science fiction book by Brian Aldiss called The Long Afternoon of Earth, which is about a world where people are 4.5 inches high, and the world is covered by a banyan forest from pole to pole. And somehow, in order to live in this savage jungle environment, the decision was made at some point long in the past, before technology was lost, to go through this shrinking process. And so people are very tiny. And but we could, like a good nanotechnology, male patriarch engineering mission type goal to lay before the research and development community would be something which I envision to be like a pair of black contact lenses, which you would have surgically implanted in the inner eyelid. And then when you closed your eyes, there would be menus hanging in space. And what this would be is the cultural interface device into a culture which was entirely virtual, sustained in electromagnetic, hologrammatic hyperspace. And the only access technology would be these black contact lenses in behind your eyelids, and so you would appear to be basically Warani, naked, painted, walking around in the rainforest. But when you closed your eyes, you would be able to send and receive faxes, scan databases thousands of miles away, receive email, look at your bank balance, play games, talk to people at a distance, exchange information, have virtual sex, be all these things that are promised, but the culture would have been dematerialized. This is a key thing. And again, psychedelics are important because psychedelics show the power of the imagination. That where we want to go live is the imagination. There's real estate out there, folks, and you want to get there first and stake your claim.
That is an interesting half of the vision, I think. But actually, in an essay I wrote on astrological upcoming patterns, that posited that maybe there would be the radical, the visionary technocrats, but they'd be balanced by the radical traditionalists who viewed technology as a crude literalization of innate human capacity. And these two groups could, in fact, coexist, and in fact trade off. But the radical traditionalists would be devoted to the restoration of the gene pool and would prefer their technology to be more of a telepathic nature by preference. But it would be nice to have exchanges between these groups. But I think two groups, so that we again were wedded to the material and embracing it rather than distanced more.
Well, the beauty of it would be that the only difference between these two groups would be you'd have to grab somebody, hold them down, and peel back their eyelid. And then if they were wearing the lens, you'd know they were a radical technocrat, and if they weren't, you'd know that they were a radical traditionalist, and otherwise there would be no difference.
Yeah, well, visionary technocrat, rad trad.
Yeah, right, rad trad, viz techo.
The other difference, of course, would be what was actually like in the consciousness, of each individual, the radical technique that you were saying, and the Warani. Because, for example, like the Warani, I think that they have the most, as far as like the most advanced understanding, which maybe looked at the most peak out in biological evolution as far as understanding of what, like, I mean, if there is like reality on this physical plane here, then they know what it is. Because not only like, I mean, just to have an understanding of the forest where there's not one thing you don't know about, like the physical plants and ancient connection of the insects and bees and birds and animals and what's pollinating what, what's dispersing what seeds. Like, I mean, that, like no other tribe, I think these people living in the most diverse forest on Earth at the base communities, these dudes, like, I mean, while the visionary technocrat with his things in his eyes is
well, but don't you actually think that once information or once technology is no longer manifest in matter, it will come to look much more like nature? In other words, the reason technology has straight lines and all that is these are engineering constraints dictated by gravity and design. If information were made of light, it would look very much like the rainforest. And then you would like transcend the dualism of nature and techne, and it would just be one weird thing.
But there may well be a coevolution in the sense of everything pulsing together, that as the technology becomes outwardly manifest, the inner telepathic capacity, they mutually co-evolve at the same time. But I think one without the other is the Atlantean fallacy.
Well, the jungle at night seems very, very electrical and electronic, and you can tell that there's infrared signals and that databases are cycling and power is being used because peak users have gone offline and just all these homeostatic regulators are working.
Even for those of us who haven't yet had the implants.
Yes, that's what I'm saying.
That's right. Well, we're agreeing.
Yeah.
themes of nanotechnology, etc., are expounded in a software novel published by the Aquarian Research Foundation, I think, out of Philadelphia. But for $10, you can get the book to be read on your floppy disk, and those who are interested in micro servants, and well, it has some computer hierarchy, interesting ideas too, but I have that address at home. So they publish on software because it's more ecologically.
Yeah, well, we're headed somewhere. I mean, I think that what people don't realize is that business as usual is off the menu.
Oh, it's finished.
There's no, even the straight people, the data which crosses their desks on human population, resource extraction, epidemic diseases, toxification of the environment, retreat of species, it's happening. The spin down to something is underway, and then the question is, what is it? Is it just grim death and we turn the planet into a weedy lot and then that's it? Or what about all this transcendental appetite for cosmic breakthrough that also accompanies it? It's very hard to be a rational person and tell where it's going.
There's the blue butterfly.
Ooh, fabulous. The Kinabata are waiting.
Somebody.
There's a blue butterfly in that book.
Well, there's another book called Brainchild, which is a very nice extrapolation of where a lot of trends are going. Takes it forward several thousand years into a wild future, but it includes a lot.
Yeah, well, see, I think the rate of acceleration is so intense that it's inconceivable that there's a human future even measured in hundreds of years. It's all, this is it. The collision is actually happening in slow motion before your startled eyes, the end of the second millennium, and Western civilization is completely exhausted. It hasn't a clue. All these wonderful methods that were going to lead us to Platonic truth and union with God and the gates of the heavenly city. The gates of the heavenly city is Spanish Harlem, and God looks like a psychotic on crack. So we have to sort of back off to the archaic moment, which was the last sane moment that we ever knew before we committed ourselves to this shell game launched by the monotheists and their stooges and so forth.
We've already had Mr. 666 as president for 8 years.
Well, we had 19 years, don't we?
Till 2012?
Yeah, that's your date.
That's my date. I like that. It coincides well with the end of the Mayan calendar and with my mathematical models of change. And because, see, I think that it's self-limiting and that change is accelerating faster and faster, and that there is no principle on which you can then say it will accelerate to a certain speed and then no faster. The more conservative position is that it will just keep, increasing. And what's happening is that all the rest of the time in the cosmos is like being used up in this enormous compressive whirlpool at the end of planetary history.
One of the major keys there, of course, is the mystery of time. Because we say, how much time do we have left? And through the astrological lens, we say on a realistic, in quotes, level, there's not enough time. But when we talk about dream time, irrational time, like in fairy tales, when you enter the spirit mound and you spend a day and you come back and several years have passed, irrational time, the turbulence drives us into deeper access to different parts of our psyche where there's more time.
Well, we could escape into the dream.
But it's not exactly escape, it's replenishment to be able to deal with the rapidity. It's again like when you're asleep and you're dreaming and the phone rings in real life, you wake up in a couple of seconds, but in the dream you've had an elaborate eon lead up to incorporate the ringing. There's a mystery there about the stretching of time in different states?
Well, one way of thinking about this eschatological event in 2012, I mean, just for heuristic purposes, of course, is suppose what it involved was a planetary collision with a planet-sized black hole. What happens when a planet falls into a black hole? Well, I think what happens is that you have it through relativistic stretching, the moment of infalling takes forever from the point of view of those who experience it. From the point of view of an exterior observer, the planet is seen to be absorbed into the black hole. But because reaching the singularity at the center means attaining the speed of light, as you approach the singularity, time goes more and more slowly, and so it would take an eternity to approach that. So here's a kind of eat your cake, have it too scenario, where it depends on where you stand, exactly what your account of events are. But experientially, it lasts forever. See, I think that, that the idea that something is going to transform reality beyond recognition, at first, when seen through the eyes of probability theory and positivism, seems miraculous and unlikely, because you say, well, surely the end of the world happens only once every 5 billion years, so what are the odds that I will see it in my 70-year span of life? But that's not the right approach, because novelty begets novelty, and the presence of human history as a part of what's going on here and now on this planet is like the rippling on the surface of a body of water immediately before some enormous form breaks through from beneath. Human history is the annunciation call of the approaching singularity. I mean, if the singularity were not approaching, we would still be happily hurling excrement at each other in the canopies of African rainforests. It is the approach of the breakthrough being felt, anticipated across 4 or 5 million years of evolution, that draws us to erect the fragile tools of mathematics and radiotelescopy and all this other stuff in order to be there to catch the fly ball when it falls into our mitt, you see. So we are the proof of the presence of the other in the planetary ecology. Otherwise, there would just be squirrel monkeys, brine shrimp, and antelope, But we represent something else, pushing into the biological realm, mind, purpose, intentionality, for some reason. And, then the Christers and all the rest leap forward to explain why it is. But nobody knows why it is. They just flail you with some laundry list of moral do's and don'ts. That's where they come out with it. But what it is it's a complete mystery. But something is shaping us to its own vision of what we should be. History is not pushed by causal momentum toward entropy. History is pulled in ever-tightening gyre toward confrontation with the attractor that is its maker, and toward which it vectors across hundreds of thousands of years. It's something odd loose here, and the use of language and the production of art and magic and shamanic vision and high technology, all these things are feedback telling you there's a very weird form of radiation in the neighborhood. We've gone beyond the birds and the bees here to something else, and the something else is growing. It's an embryo of some sort. It's in process of concrescence, Whitehead's word, concrescence. It has an appetite for expressing itself as a nexus of novel connections, civilization based on animal organization, based on the biosphere, based on the geology of the planet, based on the dynamics of the solar system, something reaching out toward itself. And it's the stuff with which it mirrors itself. Weird.
We pulse back at it, of course. In the sense that we vote for reality with our imagination. So when people,
Well, are we thinking it up? To some degree we are. In the sense that technology, every artifact of technology began as an idea in a human mind. And technology is now shaping the destiny of the planet. This means ideas born in the human mind are now shaping the destiny of the planet. Well, what is the human mind? And what is it about the human brain, mind, body triad that allows us to download these ideas into the stream of cosmic consequentiality? Antelope don't do that. Caiman don't do that. Nobody else is downloading ideas into the swift-running current of cosmic unfoldment. Everybody else is playing the old evolutionary solitaire game with gene mutation, environmental pressure, so forth and so on. We've invented a new game.
Well, what mind are we born of?
Well, this is the question.
Is there another reality of which we are the construct and the development of, or the experiment?
Are we growing toward a dissolution of the boundary between this world and some other world? Is it the world beyond death that the shaman and the seers and all these people rave about? Does the human soul actually, is it indestructible, or does it survive the morphology of the body, and then in what dimension and under what constraints and toward what purpose? It's all questions. Nothing is secure. Science has told us very little of what we actually are interested in when we think about how we're born out of blackness and go down into the earth after a very short time. You just get a glimpse. It's like a DMT trip. You barely get your sea legs before they're saying, "Deja vu, deja vu."
So since nothing's secure in the dream mind body, we are the seeds of the children in the unborn world.
Sounds good to me.
There's a line in a Christian hymn that I like. In the sweet by and by shall we meet on that beautiful shore.
That's it. By the water of Babylon,
Well, I think
Babylon.
we're preparing for disembodiment. I think a lot of that. There's a lot of people believe in that.
You mean the glory and
Not the rapture, not that disembodiment.
not the rapture.
Not with those people. I'm talking about psychedelic seekers who are.
Well, but all of these are different takes. They're all different takes on this intimation of an ontological bolt of lightning. It could happen. It could happen. Long is the faith. But looks what's come and gone. Much has come and gone since the mushroom munching ancestors of the African dawn moment. And we say the world never changes, but on the other hand, Babylon is ruins, and so much has happened, and in such a little bit of time. 10,000 years ago, the curtain had barely risen, and then, just like the monkeys go berserk, and before you know it, instruments are being hurled out of the solar system, the human genome is being probed, radiation levels are rising, the ozone hole's disappearing, the ice caps are in retreat. It's like they just pulled the plug. 10,000 years? It's as catastrophic as an asteroid impact from the point of view of most ecosystems, Just blam, the slow collision, not this time with an iron, a chondracious chondrite, but with a mind. mind arose on this planet, or came to this planet, or emerged out of this planet, or something. But the moment that it did, in its ability to non-genetically express itself, codes, there was some breakthrough in coding ability and information manipulation, and they were off to the races. And the momentum of these processes is now virtually unstoppable. Nobody knows where this is all going, and there's no plan. There's no plan.
The ecologist Howard Odom wondered, perhaps out of desperation, that maybe human beings' purpose on Earth was to release all of the carbon which had gotten locked up underground, let it back into the air.
I had a professor in college, and his cosmic scheme was, he thought that someday, he thought that human civilization was essentially a mining project, and that someday flying saucers would appear and harvest all the fissionable material and just say, thank you very much, we have real need for this back on Bimbanhu, and now you can go back to swinging through the trees. In the same way, that we use bacteria to sequester gold in low-grade gold ore. You pour bacteria into the gold slurry, and the bacterium pick up the gold and sequester it in their cell tissue. Then you harvest the bacteria and get the gold. Obviously, these bacteria are not hip to the the magnificent role they're playing in the production of class wedding rings.
Was that Sitchkin?
Huh?
Was that Sitchkins that you're talking about?
Which?
The theory that we're here for these other space beings.
No. It was not put forth with that kind of seriousness. No, it was Joe Tussman.
It's like Kurt Vonnegut's dark Scorpio vision that the entire sum of human history is in order to spell high from one star system to another.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
That kind of Scorpio tape.
Well, there are, interesting possibilities. I mean, the universe is a very dynamic place. Every hard body in the solar system is heavily cratered with asteroidal impacts. Asteroids have probably been major shapers of evolution on this planet. They wiped out the dinosaurs. They gave the mammals and the flowering plants a running chance where otherwise they would have been completely marginalized. There are older impact scars on the body of the planet. I think that maybe the prodigal journey of Indo-European human beings into matter is something about how we may really need thermonuclear bombs and delivery systems and deep space radar.
And that's what they're hoping for.
In order to, shield the garden from incoming cosmic crapola. Because clearly every once in a while the field is tilled rather dramatically. And
but it's a little suspiciously like the boys' excuse for not cleaning up their room.
True, although it isn't an either-or situation. You don't need to spend a lot of money to protect the Earth from asteroid impact. Probably 1/30th of the Earth's military outlay would do lavishly, thank you. But I don't really think it is a cosmic catastrophe like that. I think it's something built into biology. And that biology has a season, and that intelligence is the shedding of the pollen or something, and that, there are larger purposes than you can perceive if you only have a few thousand years of a time slice to understand what's going on the planet.
Or we may be being pushed to a point where, since we don't know what's ahead of us, that as Marshall McLuhan says, everyone on spaceship Earth is crew. also an attitude switch to be a creative participant in a living universe rather than an observer.
Yes, then, but the question is, of what does participation consist? This is the Tolstoyan question, What then is to be done? You can't figure out what's to be done unless you actually think you understand what's going on. And that's such a staggering leap. How can one have confidence that one knows what's going on?
By looking inside, because, for me, I see the wilderness as the wilderness within. And as we cut down the wilderness because there's the unknown, to look inside and see the wilderness and the unknown inside, which has not been enfolded to its fullest or unfolded to its fullest. The wilderness has so much unknown. It's only a material synchronicity that handshakes something that's inside, which I don't think as a human race we've really actually explored yet. Only certain masters have popped up, like the Jesus Christs and the Buddhas and the Moses and all,
Boys, bunch of boys.
Well, the problem, I'm sympathetic, but the call within, this was Heidegger's answer, don't forget. And Heidegger it's not possible to reclaim Heidegger. This is the bad news.
Well, why not? Can't you just feel within what is to be done without having to understand it logically? But
No, because what happens then is you make Heidegger's mistake. The call was deep, loud, broad, and clear in 1933 to join the Nazi Party, so he did. This call within, you got to go lightly with it. This is the great problem of existential ethics, that once you get the moral relativism firmly established, then you try to build an ethical system out of this, and the best Sartre and Heidegger and these people can do is talk about the call within. But the political mistakes of the 20th century show that the call within, for crying out loud, is sometimes, the baying of demons. What are you going to do?
Well, you're saying you can understand, and then on the basis of logical understanding do something. I think in the same way you can develop your intuitive sense and develop the call within, not in a rational basis, but in other bases of which psychedelics help. So when you feel that call, you're doing something not, I hate to say correct, but just in the natural order of things.
Well, I agree with you that psychedelics help, that by putting in a natural governor, it helps. But if you try to follow the depth of the call without some kind of a filter like that, I think it gets problematic, and that this is what was wrong with the 20th century. I don't defend it or even particularly have an opinion about it. I just know how to recite all sides of the issue. This is the Nietzschean problem, that once you claim absolute freedom, you go beyond good and evil. Nobody knows how to navigate there, as the history of the 20th century so abundantly proves. This is worth talking about, maybe not here or now, but what I like to ask people is, we take psychedelics, affirm psychedelics. The question interesting to discuss, even just within your own mind, is what's so great about it? Can we make a legitimate claim to moral superiority over the poor benighted souls who don't do it? Aldous Huxley said of psychedelics, they are neither necessary nor sufficient for the attaining of salvation. He called them gratuitous graces, meaning you're sure glad you have it, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient. I think Yes, but some things are necessary and sufficient. I think that the existential, there are only two positions in the building of a moral philosophy until psychedelics came along. There's fascism through revelation. This is all theories which begin with God told us to do it this way. So then, so that's, revelation, ethics through revelation. Then the other possibility, which the existentialists after Nietzsche tried to get into, was through intuition, the depth of the call. And this was essentially the same impulse in the Protestant Reformation, where personal prayer and a personal relationship to God was supposed to replace these schools of sweating theologians who were going to tell you how the boar ate the cabbage. Well, it seems to me, unbeknownst or unremarked, into the midst of this age-old dilemma has come a third possibility, which is ethic on the basis of symbiosis with the natural environment through psychedelics. And that really what is waiting to be born is a psychedelic ethic. We occasionally in our groups, we drift into, like the discussion about how every woman should have only one natural child, or different things that we've talked about at different times, not here this time. But what these are incipient probings toward a psychedelic ethic, a moral vision that could be a counterweight to the fundamentalist vision and the existential vision, both of which are observed to be inadequate. Yeah.
I like to think that psychedelic experience is kind of like a metaphor of the future, for the future, in that when we're getting high, everything is changed, but nothing is really changed. So maybe the change that's going to happen is like if ever there was some kind of synchronistic global change of perception, the world would be indelibly changed, but nothing would really change.
Yeah, sometimes I've thought of it. It could be as simple as on dawn, December 22nd, 2012, everyone begins to behave appropriately.
How about February 2nd, 1993?
Pick a day.
Because I think the first cause that can emerge from psychedelic is the transcending of hinayana honkyism, personal salvation, and that in a sense the language says, can we agree as a first premise to have an inclusive vision that includes everything in the final vision of how it all collaborates. Then you eliminate the dark call, the illusion of the dark call of elitism or hinayana honkyism.
Well, the thing to do is to avoid the illusion of necessary activity. That's where the dualism lies. There's no imperative. There's no imperative. Otherwise, it gets crazy in a hurry. So you just have to have the faith that, the plan is on time, and this escalator you've been furiously racing up is in fact moving under its own power.
I really disagree with that.
That the escalator is moving on its own power?
No, that there's no necessity for action. I mean, in an ultimate sense, of course it's true. But we live in a relative world, and one thing that we learned in the 60s is that if we all drop out, there was a whole group of ready to jump right in and fill all those places that we left and lead the ship of state to yet more destructive heights.
Well, inaction is not exactly dropping out. My objection to action is it assumes understanding. In order to act, you have to know what should be done. Who can claim to know what should be done? I interviewed Ram Dass in Prague this summer, and it completely blew my mind. The guy actually believes he knows what should be done. He doesn't doubt his own judgment.
We all know what's to be done.
What's wrong with that, though?
Well, it's amazing to me. I've never known a moment of that kind of certitude about what was going on. It's like interviewing a Martian for me. I think, this person believes they understand what's going on. Bizarre. I feel it the way you would touch a Maserati. We don't know what's going on. For example, I mean, we mentioned the asteroid thing. We want to save the rainforest. It seems perfectly rational to wish to save the rainforest. If, however, and we already have one example of this occurring, an asteroid is going to strike the Earth in the next 10,000 years. Saving the rainforest appears to be a completely stupid place to put energy. What we should have been doing was learning how to blow up asteroids. Our heart was in the right place. The impulse was good, save the Earth, but we completely misperceived the dimension of danger.
Why not both?
Well, sure, but then there are 10 other of these things as well, or 20 other. So better to believe, I think, that how can it possibly be that the fate of things comes to rest on a talking monkey? What kind of cosmos would write a script like that? Far more likely that we just simply are a self-important monkey. And so we run around saying, we must do something.
Well, that really assumes that you are really, it sounds as though that assumes we're caught in the we are a separate identity. Okay?
You mean from the planet?
Yes, from everything, that we are a separate identity. And,
don't you think we must have been there must be some essential rightness to where we've come to here? That yes, it represents high risk. It would have been less risky if there had been no human civilization. But on the other hand, a whole bunch of things wouldn't exist that do exist. And nature is truly mysterious. Truly beyond rational apprehension. And so the best thing is a religious attitude of reverent psychedelic awe and a faith in the dynamics of the thing and like that. Basically faith in the larger dynamics, that we can't possibly have gotten loose from the control systems that keep the stars in their orbits and the oceans moving. It's just that this represents an experiment of some sort. I mean, many times in the Earth's history, remember that once oxygen was a toxic gas, and all life on Earth was under threat from the accumulation of oxygen. Solving that problem laid the basis for eukaryotic life. Once there were no flowering plants, and the death of a climaxed ecosystem, I dare say rainforests from here to everywhere, gone in a single moment. And there's an older scar where the same thing happened. So I think it's important to live and to be, but the anxiety of the uncompleted plan, I think, is a misperception. The Chinese guy Wi Po Yang said, worry is preposterous. Worry is preposterous. You don't know enough to worry. And I think concern is legitimate. Concern, but we're watching a beautiful game unfold. And I don't say that it won't end with the extinction of the human species. I mean, if we can absorb something like this asteroid hit, then, but the whole thing is, it is, no species controls its destiny. No species ever has controlled its destiny. And this species is no exception. This is a dynamic larger than that. And the fact that it's so much about freedom and the illusion of control is part of the fascinating dance. I'm an optimist. I'm very, very hopeful. I think, we didn't talk here about the one woman, one child thing, but it's an idea whose inherent power to change the world, you can understand in 30 seconds. If every woman had only one natural child, in 40 years the population of the planet would drop in half. No wars, no artificial epidemics, nothing, just cut in half. In the next 40 years it would fall in half again. We could live off the recycled infrastructure that would be liberated by this sort of thing. The women most likely to respond to this message are high-tech citizens of industrial democracies, not poor women.
Have to respond to that message. The women are like crying out to respond to that message, and it, like
to have only one natural child.
Well, so many women are struggling against the how just being on the childbearing cycle.
Well, I think you could put you could guarantee cradle to the grave health care for any woman on the planet who would have one natural child. You could make it so attractive that it would have to happen.
Talk to the Pope? But it's
yeah, well, you have to hang. You don't talk to the Pope. You hang the Pope. Then you talk to the Dalai Lama after he watches the Pope hang.
But you've got to change that. Is the countries where the men want the male child?
No, but see, these are not the countries where the problem is. A really interesting thing is a child born to a woman in Malibu or Chicago will use between 800 and 1,000 times more resources than a child born to a woman in Bangladesh. So we preach birth control in the third world. This is absolutely stupid. You have to convince 1,000 Bangladeshi women to have one child to achieve the equivalent impact on the environment of convincing a woman in Chicago. And this woman in Chicago is well educated and can be reached through the rational appeals familiar to members of Western civilization. The Bangladeshi woman is an Orthodox Hindu. So we're going at it completely wrong. In 15 years, if say 15% of the women of childbearing age in high-tech societies were to do this, 15% of those women for 15 years, you could immediately measure the relaxation on resource extraction, output of toxics, electricity production, so forth and so on. People like to think...
consume less resources, and doesn't that Bangladeshi woman want to consume more?
Well, that's also...
On the women!
Please, let's just say something about that every man produce one child.
Yeah, try that.
Well, but it's very easy for a man to do that. I mean, it's worth saying. But obviously, women have for a very long time been out of the decision-making loop on cultural destiny. Notice that the interesting thing about this plan is that men are not central managers and purveyors of it. It's something women could do. It's the first solution I've ever heard. It was suggested by the mushroom, by the way. It's the first solution I've ever heard that did not depend on men for its execution. The powerlessness of women is largely related to the multiple births that they undergo, which hold them to the domestic scene. It's incredibly... What you could say to a woman in a high-tech society is you could say, would you like to have vastly more disposable leisure time? Would you like to have a vast increase in disposable income? And would you like to have genuine status as a true cultural hero in the battle to save the planet? In other words, for the first time ever, as far as I can tell, you create a plan which appeals and to the selfish drive of the individual. What has always screwed plans up before is that the two were opposed. You said, well, I'd like to give to the poor, but then I'd be less rich, or something like that. Here is a plan where you attain greater freedom, greater monetary power within the society, and you are doing the politically correct thing, the most politically correct thing that could be done. And I think the reason we haven't heard this proposed...
Is because you've got a pope.
I think there are a lot of women in high-tech societies that are a little confused about this, and they think that they should be producing more children because of the contribution they think and the good lives that they can give these kids.
Well, this is because the society has a peculiar set of values. I mean, yes, you would have to control the Pope and all this sort of thing, but on the other hand, the final solution against the Jews came to be seen as a bad idea. Why should the Pope be allowed to pursue social policies which every year push hundreds of millions of people into poverty, degradation, and early death, and not face the tribunal of international opinion? I mean, what is it? Only Nazis commit genocide? Is that the deal? I think we are going to have to begin to address some of our social problems and some of the more irresponsible social elements that run rampant in society. I mean, it's all very well to have a set of religious ideals, but when you start deflecting the populations of entire continents into a situation of pandemic emergency, well, then you just knock that off.
I'd like to suggest two things of your theory. One is that there's a lot of states who still require a man, if they're married, permission for the woman to be sterilized, where the opposite is not true. And second of all, the sterilization of a woman is much harder than a sterilization of man. Mm-hmm. So if we go back to if a man would only have one child, we would have much easier time in the United States. And that is already...
Well, if you like it that way, the point is not to have population replacement, 2 children per couple. The point is to have 1 child per couple. And if you like thinking of it as 1 child per man, then 1 child per man.
Well, the couple concept really doesn't exist.
No, the couple concept wouldn't exist because the couple concept is driven by the multiple birth style of reproduction, for one thing.
For me, I think I would die in peace if I lived in a paradigm shift where the commonality of an attitude of power with rather than power over would exist. And then all these issues find its proper place because then we live with power with and not power over. And I would say I've witnessed a great human enterprise or participated in a great human enterprise.
Well, here's to it. Let's head for lunch.
Hold your gas.
Well, we'll try this afternoon here, and if the rain runs us out, the rain runs us out, after all. Is there anything anybody's burning to say that's accumulated while we're settled in?
I've got a quick one. Can you overdose on DMT?
No, probably not if you're self-administering and smoking, because I think it would simply, you would be unable to get yourself together enough to get the pipe and the match and everything coordinated. I've seen people who thought they had overdosed, but they just got a full dose. I don't know what an overdose would look like. The LD50 is, I don't know if it's ever been determined anyway. It's very high. People have asked me if it's dangerous, and I think the answer to that is probably only if you fear death by astonishment. But, you know, this is a possibility, and so, you know, you may laugh now, but if it planted you, you'd be real amazed as you went out, right? Oh my God, it's killing me! I'm so amazed.
Have any of the plant sources matched the smoke experience?
Of DMT? Well, if you make ayahuasca and you make it very, very strong, and then you sit in silent darkness and you work with your breath, and you really have a load on, after about an hour or an hour and 20 minutes, you can actually reach a place where you look around and say, it looks like a DMT flash is going on, folks. So, but it's the part of what makes DMT so shocking is the speed with which it happens. And that in itself lends to the psychedelic nature of it, because it's like being struck by lightning or something. I mean, some people, when you give it to them, they don't think that they did the substance. They think that they were about to do the substance and then were struck by lightning or something. So people sometimes come out of it demanding to know what happened. They say, well, what happened? I say, well, you did it. I say, that's it? That's what it is? I say, yes. And they say, oh, I thought that a fighter plane fell into the apartment house. Something like that.
I've got something I'd like to get out.
Sure.
I had an experience one time with DMT. I'd like to know if you've had a similar experience. I had an experience one time with DMT. I'd like to know if Terence had any experiences similar, which is, as I was comfortably sitting down against the wall in the afterglow, the still things that going on, is that the whole field of activity, which was an experience, just parted like a movie screen. And there was just absolutely nothing but a very soft light, yellow light behind that, which just fairly blew me away.
This was, you were coming down.
Yeah.
And then suddenly there was this sense of the visual field splitting and something lying behind it.
Yeah, it drew apart like a curtain.
I never had exactly that. I remember I had a very anomalous DMT trip once. It was sort of like that. Here's what it was. It was really a strange one. I can't remember where I was. But anyway, I smoked the DMT and I expected to see the chrysanthemum and everything as I described. And instead, when I opened my eyes, not when I opened my eyes, but when I broke through into the space, I seemed to see red flocked wallpaper in a fleur-de-lis on a wall of some sort. It looked like red flocked wallpaper. And as I looked at this, I dropped my head forward, and there was a water fountain spigot of the kind that you depress and it shoots a stream of water coming out of a marble basin. And it was just perfectly realistic. And then above it, and then I saw above it, was this flocked red wallpaper. And as I was trying to get my bearings in this situation, I turned like 90 degrees, and there was a curtain of red velvet. And I walked through the curtain, and there was a DMT trip up on a huge CinemaScope screen. And I just sat down in the aisle seat, and then the trip happened. But there had been this peculiar hesitation where I was apparently in some Art Deco movie palace somewhere on the foyer landing at the water fountain, and I never quite understood what that was about or why it happened, but it had the same quality of the parting curtain revealing the trip somehow already in progress. One of the things that goes on in DMT that's sort of odd is you perceive your body geometry differently. You seem to have an infantile body. You can tell that your head is massive and your body is small and your arms and legs are short. And at times we've played around with the idea that once you smoke DMT, all subsequent trips are like journeys back to this first trip. It's as though you open a nexus in time in your personality, and then every subsequent trip you just return to this open place. There's a very funny feeling about it that is something about the past, something about time. It's hard to put your finger on. I remember one time, I mean, this is more explicit, but these are the more anomalous trips. I remember once, it must have been 25 years ago, a long time ago, I smoked DMT with these two women, both of which I had had a relationship with in the past. And I was living with one of them at the time, and we smoked the DMT together, and I opened my eyes at one point, and one of these women was just aging furiously. I mean, her hair was turning white, her teeth were turning in her mouth, her skin was melting, and it was absolutely startling. And the other one was getting younger at an equal rate, going, 25, 21, 17, 16, 4, and it was like, it didn't feel like it was about my relationship to them or what I thought about A over B. It looked more profound than that. I mean, it looked like one of them was going forward in time and one of them was going backward in time, and it was right in front of me, and I didn't say anything. I was too shocked. I didn't know what in the world you could say. I just gaped at this spectacle, and then closed my eyes and went off into something else.
Also, do you feel that there's a relationship between fractals and DMT experience?
Well, fractals and DMT, in trying to account for these little creatures, I've entertained many different kinds of theories. And one theory, which is I call the fractal personality theory, is, if you had a mirror and you were sitting on a concrete floor and you were to bring the mirror down and shatter it in front of yourself, you would not see a shattered reflection of yourself. You would see hundreds of little whole reflections of yourself. It would be as though you had literally blown your personality to smithereens. And Jung talks about, in Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is definitely his best book, I recommend it for everybody, psychedelic, he talks about what are called kibiri, the alchemical elves that appear in the final stage of the alchemical opus and are the helping elementals that bring the alchemical opus to conclusion. And he has this wonderful passage where he's trying to be the scientist, but he's also trying to be true to this completely freaky phenomenon that he's talking about. And he says something like, autonomous fragments of the psyche, having escaped from the reigning control of the ego, dance and cavort around the startled artifacts. You think, Mysterium Conjunctionis. It's subtitled A Study of the Union of Opposites in Alchemy. Huh? Conjunctionis, Conjunctionis, or something like that. So it's possible to imagine that what happens on DMT is you literally, here's one way to dissolve the ego. You blow it apart. And like mercury, or that's another good metaphor, like smashing a flask of mercury on the floor in front of you, the stuff of psyche, the fluid metal of the self, sends back then 1,000 reflections. And they all are distorted reflections, as they would be, and they all are peculiarly familiar, hauntingly familiar, because guess who it is? It's your good old self, but put through some filter, some distorting lens of transformation that gives you the impression that, you're now encountering a swarm of alien insectoid, machine, elf, toy, cyborg viruses, or something like that. What could have been the question?
Fractals.
Ah, yes, got it.
I think there may be a fractal part to it. If you think of normal neurotransmitters as having a rhythm, moving in, moving out of a receptor, kind of a stable rhythm. And then these slightly off chemicals just throw the rhythm off. And it's like instead of a mirrors facing each other and you just get a standing wave of the two mirrors, they spread a little bit, and then all of a sudden you get a kaleidoscope.
Yes, I mean, this is a reasonable, this is a weirdly halfway materialistic, halfway Jungian explanation of what is happening. It doesn't quite cover it. I mean, when you're there and they're dancing around you, it's seen to be totally inadequate as an explanation. But as we sit here, presumptuous to the extreme, it seems reasonable, and possible. Anything else anybody wants to talk about before yeah.
What do you think about enlightenment?
You mean in the Buddhist sense of enlightenment? Well, this sort of goes to this question which we've talked about along other avenues of approach, which is the question, do psychedelics have anything to do with so-called spirituality? Enlightenment, well, there are different notions of what enlightenment is, first of all. I mean, there's a soft version, a kind of Protestant version, where people say, well, enlightenment is something which comes and goes from each of us many times a day. If we could but cling to it, we would know it, and it is, our absent friend weaving in and out of ordinary experience. That's the soft version of enlightenment. But then, there's a hard version of enlightenment which says if a single sentient being attains enlightenment for a single nanosecond anywhere in the kiliocosm of eternity, then all sentient beings will instantly be sucked into the presence of the parinirvana, and the illusion of space and time will collapse, and the Tathagata will be immanent, and so forth and so on. I sort of like the hard version because it makes it easier to know when you're in the presence of it. I don't know. I mean, this is an interesting question. I suppose, they do. An Orthodox Buddhist of the hardcore sort, I think they're fairly contemptuous of psychedelicos, and what they would lay on us is that we are obsessed with samsara, that our love of the 10,000 things will forever stand between us and union with the undescribable, unutterable, Platonian non-entity outside of all realms of description and anticipation and so forth and so on. Probably true. It's just that, buying into that thing exists at all is a major step. And, I'm willing to play the Pied Piper there. I'm interested in the 10,000 things. I mean, what thrills me are museums full of butterflies and libraries full of books and galleries full of paintings and parties full of women and just the multiplicity of things. And that's what psychedelics seem to celebrate. On the other hand, it's very hard to be a psychedelic person, I think, and not participate in one of the central tenets of both Buddhism and Hinduism, which is the primacy of mind. mind only, the dogma that, all manifestation is somehow a product of the ratiocination of mind. That's a pretty Buddhist point of view. I think you can make progress spiritually with psychedelics, but not necessarily. Yeah, do. But I think generally it's true that there would be not only no Zen, but no New Age, no this, no that. All of this really goes back. The people who have founded all these alternative therapies and schools and methods inevitably were Lodis in the 60s. Yeah.
It just might be of interest, the most recent issue of Gnosis magazine is
Uh-huh.
on the issue of psychedelics and spirituality.
Great issue.
Yeah, I wasn't so keen on it. I mean, I didn't...
It's not great, but it's got some discussion on it.
It does have discussion on it, and it's rarely discussed. It should be discussed more, I think. Where psychedelics and the spiritual marketplace find themselves shoulder to shoulder, I think, is when you run up against the adherents of Shaivite yogas of various sorts, where there is definitely a stress on visionary phenomena, internal transformation of body states, magical powers, so forth and so on. And, there's quite a feeling of competitiveness. I studied some of those yogas. I certainly don't claim to be an expert. My conclusions about Indian spirituality were largely unhappy ones. I mean, it seemed to me that the shell of something was there, but that it had been for millennia counterfeited and adulterated and manipulated, and that I can't imagine a longer path to spiritual breakthrough than the path that leads through the ashrams and so forth of Mother India.
Let me mention a couple things. You mentioned Shaivism, and I have to say that I've been fooling around with Shiva worship in particular. And it's come because nobody else does it, so you don't have to worry about groups. But anyway, that's something I've been studying. It does fall right into different budget streams. But I think if you think of your spiritual goal as the golden city you're trying to get to, and you're in the jungle, and you know where it is, if you drop this substance, it's like climbing a tree. You get up high, you can see it. You know what direction it is. And you may go back down and then walk there. You don't want to just keep climbing the tree to look at it. You want to keep walking.
Well,
and now and then you still got to climb the tree to find a way.
Yeah, that's the metaphor that I find most useful and neutral for talking about psychedelics, is the dimensional metaphor. In other words, when you say climb a tree, what you mean is gain a higher dimensional vantage point on the landscape of experience. And this is what the psychedelic does, and then what you do with that point of view is entirely up to you, yeah.
I think I'm starting to view my journey as that the barometer for the usefulness of these experiences and what keeps drawing me on is how they come back into my life and are rewarding, and how I view the relationships that I have primarily with my family and my spouse, and then those people that I come in contact with, and whether or not those relationships seem to be more valuable and authentic, more compassionate, more other understanding than they have in previous years, and that personal insight to the changes that are occurring in my life seem to be drawing me, and as such are a reflection of what I understand spiritual growth to be about, to try to be here in a better way at the moment and the time and the place that I'm in. And so I have a personal perspective that the pollen of psychedelics in my life is helping me unfold in a way that I'm looking at the emerging flower and appreciating it greatly. In that sense, it's highly spiritual.
Well, it's a catalyst for the imagination, and definitely the spiritual unfoldment is an act of imagination. There may be other things that are acts of imagination that aren't like that. I mean, like the designing of a building or the managing of a company. They also might profit from psychedelics. But for sure, I think if you have spiritual intent as a precondition, psychedelic use is just going to be very important to you. All the spiritual methods seem to work in the presence of psychedelics. The methods which, in my experience, largely don't work any other time. For example, yantra, mantra, chanting, visualization, conjuration in some cases. All of these things which are very resistant to functioning in ordinary mental space work like a charm just over the line. So I imagine, that why our religions are so pale and tepid and unsatisfying is we're like sitting around in fine automobiles, but nobody bothered to fill the gas tank. And so, we play the radio, and we turn on the windshield wipers and the blinkers, but we don't go anywhere. And it's because what you need is spiritual technique, shamanic technique, religious practice in the presence of a boundary-dissolving pharmacological fuel. And then it really happens. And if you have the pharmacological fuel but not the spiritual intent, then what you become is a philosopher of some sort, a Michael Taussig. I mean, I'm really interested in Michael Taussig. I've never met the guy, but when you read his book on ayahuasca, it's wonderful. That's what makes horse races, you see. But I'm sure we would agree, whether we think the book is awful or wonderful, that there is not a spiritual bone in this man's body, not an atom of spirituality. And yet, he's taken as much ayahuasca as I or Sparrow or anybody here, under the right conditions, with the real people. And so then seeing what does it do to that kind of mind, a mind without spiritual intent, is fascinating. In any case, I think you can't catalyze your imagination without becoming an exceptional person. You may become an exceptional bore. You may become exceptionally overbearing or exceptional at designing jet skis. But because it catalyzes the imagination, it propels you forth out of the ordinary. Yeah, what did you wanted to say?
For me, it seems a real simple way of looking at things to say the reason ordinary people aren't high, including you and me, a lot of the time, is that our dream stuff is squandered. It's squandered in regrets about the past and haftas about the future. And this ties in real well with the Buddhist idea of involvement with samsara. And for me, there's no conflict between the gamut of my psychedelic experiences and this idea, because, like somebody said, talking about the cigarette last night, all of a sudden you realize, oh, I'm right here, right now. And helping us collect that part of our essence, which has to do with dreaming into the present moment. As a sign, I even have no problem with Christianity. Well, I've tried to look at all the religions and see the good without the bad over the 20 years of use of psychedelics, but being in the world but not of it, what a perfect expression of the clear light, and even of flying in the hyperspectral matrix and yet still being here to enjoy things. Just to be here without fear or craving seems to be the key to understanding religions and all of my psychedelic experiences as well. And the wild dreams and visions that we have can usually make sense in terms of dream language if you choose to look at them, that they might be having some kind of dialogue of that nature.
Well, imagine how our relationship to each other and the world and the unconscious would change if somebody invented a drug, the effect of which was you remembered your dreams. And if you took this drug at night before going to sleep, the next morning you would have total recall of your dreams. I dare say total recall of our dreams would lead to the discovery that every night you discover the secret that has never been told. You know, it can never be told. It is sealed away at the center of the mandala, at the center of the mandala. But in dreams, every night, I think, we touch the stone. We unravel the ultimate secrets of our origin and our destiny. But it's amazing how well sealed against memory that is. The feeling you have with the DMT flash is that you have come in through the back door. You know, you somehow have cheated the machinery of mnemonic degradation that keeps us from recalling the dream time, really. And the Australian Aboriginal obsession with the dream time may be uniquely rooted into their well-defined genetic heritage, which is different from everybody else. In other words, this may be something very close to the surface of our accessibility, and that the tension within a culture has to do with the tension between itself and its hidden and its unconscious. I mean, in a way, I'm just recasting Freudian and Jungian perceptions in a kind of new language and saying, you know, the tension in society is caused by the degree to which we are alienated from the unconscious. That's almost a truism. Well, but if through a drug or an exercise, and there are these dream recollection yogas, we could actually overcome that, then we would be as dynamically connected as the Aboriginal peoples.
Of course, there are those troublesome people who suggest that we may still be dreaming right now, and that the point is to get out of the dream.
Well, you mean the possibility that this world is a simulacrum of some sort, that this is actually we're inside a computer or we're inside a bubble in a beer sitting at the end of the bar in a very large bar in a very strange part of the universe. This may be, I mean, I have more and more the thing personally that I struggle with as I live my life is the realization or the perception or the delusion. I mean, I'm constantly redefining it, but that I seem to be imprisoned in some kind of work of art, that this is not a life ruled by the laws of probability and statistics, that it's hideously crafted, you know, and there are themes, and it's woven like a rug. It has an intentionality that I find hair-raising and unsettling. This is called, in the parlance of pathology, delusion of reference. It's when you cease to believe that you're nobody and you begin to believe you might be somebody. This is considered proof of severe mental disturbance, and you become a candidate for sedation at this point, because usually the discovery that you're somebody excites you into inappropriate states of arousal, which means you interfere with other people being asleep, and you run around trying to inform them of the true nature of things, which is that, you know, we're all inside a computer on Vega, or we're all being manipulated by machines in the basement of the CIA, or we're all angels dancing on the head of a pin somewhere. But whatever it is, it's an extraordinary theory in the face of the momentum of simple facts. And then if you persist in this, why, you have a real problem. The only conjuration against that developing into a problem is humor. You have to have a completely jaundiced view of reality. You can't take anything seriously, including your own most serious constructs and expectations, because it is ultimately some kind of a joke. And it is, in the DMT thing, you understand this. You are in the realm of those who made the joke, and you're getting close to understanding something that you have the feeling, if it were sufficiently understood and retained, the fiction of ordinary reality as we know it would just dissolve and be seen to have been, as Alice says, well, you're just a pack of cards, something like that. That's a very DMT-like image there, by the way. The folding up into a pack of cards indicates something goes from one-dimensional matrix to another, a declension of dimensionality. You see that often in these hallucinations. They unfold like magic boxes, and then they fold up rather like magic boxes and become quite nothing,
Your image brought forth the vision of it would all then be men facing the southeast. The man who faced southeast.
Well, yeah, something like that. Or, the peculiar ending of Cien Años de Soledad. I mean, the discovery that the world is a work of art. And, don't forget that scripted into the situation, regardless of whether the rainforest is saved and the ozone hole cured and all that, is your own death. And, it will surely be terribly important, at least to you. And so then everything has this quality of being orchestrated and related to this future moment of great existential potentiality.
How much longer do you think people will die?
Will die?
When do you think the technological solution to death?
Oh, I don't think that it's a problem. So I don't see that it requires a solution. In other words, trying to avert death would be like caterpillars plotting never to undergo metamorphosis. It just means, you really have a misinformed notion of what's going on. I never thought I would come to hold these kinds of views, because it took me a long time to overcome the teachings of Holy Mother Church, you understand. But nevertheless, it seems to me that it's all tied up in the mystery of higher dimensions, and that the great teacher of metaphysics, strangely enough, is nature. Nature is the teacher of metaphysics, and this cliche, we all learn it in biology, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In other words, that the fetus in the womb duplicates the entire evolution of life, from amoeba through fish, and the bit. Well, but then why then do we halt the metaphor at birth? Obviously, then ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny throughout life. And what that means then is that inasmuch as we each end in death as individuals, then so probably the entire course of organic existence ends in a kind of closure that is a return to the inorganic. But in this process, something called organic existence has for millions of years clothed itself in the raiment of matter and has carried out this elaborate informational exchange. Matter, as it were, has been invaded by a vitality of some sort that animates it and calls it forth to procreate, build cities, write poetry, compose sonatas. And I just can't believe that this is not the descent into matter of some kind of higher dimensional thing, which is not, it doesn't require metaphysics to understand it. It's the hidden dimension of biology, that if we understood what biology is, then it would be perfectly clear to us what's going on. The reason it's not perfectly clear to us is because we don't understand what life actually is. We have a notion of how, at the most simple level, proteins are coded out of nucleic acid, but we don't even have a notion of the architecture of the DNA, how the genes are arranged. I mean, someone once said our present state of knowledge about DNA, to believe that that allows you to understand what life is, would be like possessing the telephone directory for Greater Los Angeles and believing that out of that telephone directory you could understand what Los Angeles is. You know, it's absurd. All you have are the phone numbers of the proteins at this point. Anybody else? Yeah.
Psychedelic trinity that seems useful to me sometimes. I could tie it in with a film I'd like to recommend that hasn't been mentioned, the Ralph Abram sort of documentary that you introduced, Chaos Gaia Eros. But the ecstasy, that which is worshipped at the moment of orgasm, one could speak of it as the ancient mother of life forms. The perspective from the clear light, from the hyperspatial platform, from that space totally out of all involvement, out of even the God world involvement, would be the ancient father, the immovable force, the irresistible force, the immovable object, and the working out of these two begets the divine child, and how we can learn to stay in that ecstasy and perhaps even have a garden at the same time, seems to be it.
Well, one of the things we haven't really talked about at all, but that's certainly interesting, is the relationship of psychedelics to sexuality, and then you mention orgasm. I mean, orgasm is a very interesting phenomenon. What's it for? In other words, is this necessary? There are fish that propagate. The female lays the egg and the male swims into the general neighborhood and sheds his sperm into the water. And orgasm is something which intensifies or is present and then intensifies as you ascend the mammalian phylogeny. And it's most present in higher mammals. And, you know, I would like to think that it's most expressed in human beings, but once you watch cats screw, who knows? But whatever it is, it's not necessary for the procreation of life. Well, then what's going on? Because obviously our appetite for into our society in the form of art and advertising and language. It's a very psychedelic thing, and strangely enough, it draws to itself the same kind of anxiety that we see centered around drugs. I mean, if orgasm could be made illegal, they certainly would make it illegal. It's just that it's so hardwired into the organism that short of chastity belts and barbarous things like that, nobody's been able to really get a handle on it. And it is the thing, you know, most like drugs, and triggers all these things. You know, you do it in private and nobody should, it's not observed. It's very brief, fleeting, rarely discussed. I mean, whole generations of people have apparently lived and died without being able to confirm its existence even. So
you said a lot about this in terms of connection with the other, also the need for UFOs, the need to have this other unknown that you want to just get totally into.
The felt presence of the other. yeah, I mean, I think that, we were torn, that the mystery of our predicament, I mean, the other night I talked about it in terms of the psilocybin religion on the plains of Africa, and I basically talked about it in mechanical terms. But if you want to talk about it in emotional and psychological terms, it isn't the mushroom that we were torn from, it's the trip that we were torn from. And the trip, even among people like ourselves, is rarely enough discussed in detail. I mean, the trip into the Gaian mind was a relationship of symbiosis to a higher organizing intelligence. I mean, we call it, these cliches of the New Age, the earth, our mother, and so forth and so on. It was not a cliche. It was a deeply felt emotional reality. And this is why I say, we are like abused children. We as a civilization, we are the inheritors of a dysfunctional situation based on abuse. We were torn from the breast too soon, ripped from the womb, never to know our birthright and our parentage, because instead we were plunged into the hell world of history. And it's made us pathological, made us unable to survive without the satisfaction of making war upon each other, gaining dominance over each other. The most pathological among us have proven the most adaptable in the situation of abuse and trauma called history. And the consequences were hidden for a while, for a few thousand years. But science has set loose processes now where we have to pay the piper. Turns out there is a price to be paid for this kind of narcissistic, self-destructive, unconscious, repetitious behavior. And so now certain segments of the human community are attempting to slam on the brake. And some people think, that you should join the Moonies or something. Other people say no, psychedelic drugs. Other people say Buddhism. Somebody else says vegetarianism, something else. But there's a frantic search now to find answers, because the lethal nature of business as usual has been recognized in some quarters. And I would predict that as problems deepen, as the contradictions become more intense, the desperation will spread, and eventually all answers will be looked at. Everybody who thinks they have a clue will be invited forward to have their 3 minutes at court to try and explain, because the planetary social and economic and ecological systems are beginning to shimmy and buck as the shock wave of eschatology builds up on the leading edges of our civilization. I mean, we're just like trying to push an airfoil past the speed of sound. If the airfoil is not designed correctly, it will eventually just break to pieces and explode. If, on the other hand, it has the correct aerodynamic, then the pressure will build and build and build. It's called Q in engineering terms. The Q will accumulate on all the leading surfaces, and then there'll come a moment of truth, and you're through, and it's smooth sailing, and you're through the cultural barrier or the ecological barrier. So what we're trying to do here is a rather tall order. We're redesigning the cultural airfoil in flight, because we're in flight. We have been for centuries. And now we have to change the flight configuration, or it'll be like running into a concrete wall at 1,000 miles an hour.
So how does that relate to the orgasm?
Well, the orgasm, I think, is some kind of a compass, an interior cultural compass, showing us where we want to go. Somebody mentioned Ralph's book, Chaos, Gaia, Eros. Eros is the one that informs. I mean, Kaios is the abstracting metaphor, and Gaia is the planetary context. But Eros is the impelling force. Would play the role of the Holy Ghost in an Orthodox Christian Trinity. Our drive to complexify, our drive to create art, to symbolic activity, so forth and so on, is probably all rooted in our sexuality. And the incredible synergistic effect that psychedelics have on sexuality seems to imply that, I guess, was it Tim Leary? Somebody said years ago, the most erogenous zone of your body is your brain. I mean, this is certainly true. I mean, sex is largely 90% probably an activity of the human imagination. And primates are highly sexed. I mean, our sexuality is suppressed, but this has partly to do with the rise of patriarchy and the need to control women in that situation. Our nearest genetic relatives, the pygmy chimpanzees, the bonobo, are the most sexually outrageous creatures in all of nature. I mean, their behavior is, would shame the Mitchell brothers, and they just carry on constantly like this. I mean, heterosexual, homosexual, group, this and that, everything you can imagine. And how they were able to do that in a situation where opportunistic viruses were strolling around, I don't know. But I think it is our natural inclination to be what Freud called polymorphically perverse, meaning basically if it feels good, we're willing to do it unless cultural mechanisms of some sort have been put in place. And of course, our culture is the most sexually anxious human culture presently in existence. I mean, maybe there have been more uptight cultures in the past, but certainly presently existing, I think we're toward the top of the heap. We grow very anxious when there's boundary dissolution, and it comes through orgasm. This is why the French call orgasm the little death. And it comes through psychedelics. And, the male anxiety about maintaining erection and performance and all of this has to do with boundary maintenance. And we're paradoxically set against ourselves. It's the root of most sexual neurosis. And, Freud, whatever you think of the whole ball of wax, certainly did have an insight when he saw that civilization was a circumstance consequent upon sexually neurotic and repressed behavior. Sex and drugs and rock and roll, I mean, these things seem to be pretty intimately linked. In other words, acoustical driving, sexual license, and pharmacological disruption of ordinary brain states. This is what religion was about for the first couple of million years. And then, beady-eyed eunuchs got a hold of it. Weasels, I mean, people you wouldn't leave alone with your chickens took charge and have been in charge ever since. So,
eunuch's hardly the word, though.
Terence? The concept of sex, drug, and rock and roll is always communal. It's always us. It's not solitary. And it seems like the technological revolution is lots of solitary efforts, sitting at a computer screen, sitting at home watching TV, putting earphones on with your Walkman. All that stuff seems to be more of the great barrier to light.
Well, it's a barrier to physical community, but some people might argue, that a virtual community is coming into existence. I'm not that keen to make that point. I do think that any activity that you can participate in that does not involve matter is a good thing. So it's better to access the well than to drive 60 miles to to see a friend. But I'm not an enthusiast of teledildonics and some of the more exotic technological sexual schemes that have been cooked up. The electronic network, the ultimate effect of all this electronic technology, I think, is to encourage diversity. I think that, this is a favorite beef of mine, but I think it profits people to go back and read Marshall McLuhan, that McLuhan was never assimilated, he was simply dismissed. At the same time that psychedelic drugs were suppressed, McLuhan ceased to be ever mentioned in the academy, and that he very, very brilliantly explained the impact of media on cultural dynamics. And by media, we mean any technology, from the screwdriver to LSD. Technologies change the societies that use them, always in ways that the society cannot anticipate and expect. And so I think computers are really driving a lot of this archaic tribalism. I mean, obviously, in a world with epidemics, socially transmitted and sexually transmitted diseases and stuff like that, we can't return to the simple orgy around the campfire of 20,000 years ago. And yet we need to do something operationally equivalent to that. Well, the electronic media may throw open an opportunity for that. I don't know. I don't pretend to understand it. I mean, like, for instance, my normal reaction to gratuitous violence in media is to deplore it, like everybody else does. On the other hand, I've never had to bash somebody's brains out in fury, and it may be because I've seen a lot of that done for me on celluloid, and so it has in some sense depotentiated the need for violence. In other words, maybe vicarious violence is as de-violent as we can be. Primatologists talk about, this goes back to the sexual thing again, chimpanzees that never witness other chimpanzees having sex never get it together. They masturbate their way through life. Male chimpanzees that have never seen the sex act can't get it together. Well, so then what do? We inveigh against pornography, stigmatize it, and it has to be hidden away. And yet, probably the consequence of so much soft-core and harder-core pornography on cable television is probably a measurable increase in the amount of pleasure and non-neurotic sex that people are having, because they finally saw what was permitted, or got an idea of what was permitted, and they said, my God, you can do that, and you can do that, and you can do that, well, let's get to it.
On the other hand, it may be like violence. If people see so much of it and it looks so good there, they may feel like they don't have to do it as much, or gee, when I do it, it's not as good, I'll just watch it.
Well, like I say, I don't feel strongly about these things. I think they're interesting questions, how media affects us and what's good and what's bad. Everything is very double-edged, I mean, take a concept like free trade. Sounds good. Free trade is a license for cultural murder and genocide. Free trade means I can sell crap anywhere. It means, farewell rug makers of Tajikistan, pottery makers of the upper Amazon. Crapola is headed your way, and don't try to stop it. Everything you can't figure out, until you figure out what goals you're trying to maximize. You don't know whether you want more violence in the movies or less violence in the movies, or more sex on cable TV or less, or what you're trying to do. I believe firmly in the power of the imagination and in the wisdom of the situation. Thank God I mean, imagine how despairing one would be if they believed that the solution to our problems rested in highly trained executives implementing the correct policies. I mean, my God, it means we're up shit creek without a paddle. But what the psychedelics reveal is a dynamic on a scale where, and they just basically say, do not worry, act, commit, but don't radiate anxiety, because it's just ridiculous to radiate anxiety. It vitiates energy. And some kind of plan is happening. Every situation that has been put in place on this planet from the very beginning has been eventually swapped out for something else. And, you know, we worry about the impact of human civilization, but an asteroid smashing down on this planet in a fraction of a second could do more damage by orders of magnitude than 50,000 years of human technology and pollution. So it's very interesting to try and build an ethic or a point of view when you expand your premises to try and actually encompass the real dynamic of the planetary and cosmic environment, which is unpredictable, shifting, willful, and beyond rational apprehension, largely, I think. Yeah.
Getting back to that, you were saying about television violence and something that you don't have to do because you saw it on television. There was a very famous study that came out about 2 years ago. It was reported in the Parenting magazine. It was done by the University of Minnesota or Wisconsin or somewhere like that. A little louder. There was a study done over a 20-year period of the afterlife experiences of a group of children's television watching was being monitored, what programs they watched. And 20 years later, they followed up on the people that were involved in the test. And they found that it was 100%, or 99.5% or something, of the young people who had watched violent programs were in trouble. They were in, they had the records of assault, records of solving the problems with physical activity, not by solving the problems with their mind or things that had like, they all had records. And so I think that kind of argues against your interesting and entertaining idea that maybe you don't have to because you saw it. But
Well, it could be. I mean, it's a fine line, for instance. I mean, I heard somebody recently on a talk show say, if you're going to ban books which promote psychotic violence, and they were talking about one of these horrific slasher things, and people wanted to ban. Said if you're going to ban books which promote psychotic violence, the Bible has promoted more psychotic violence than any other book in history. Immediately you jump on that sucker. On the other hand, Carolyn and I were talking the other day, and it's not exactly violence, but we learned our psychedelic. We got our psychedelic muscles working by reading H.P. Lovecraft, which introduces you to how to tolerate bad trips. Basically, ideas so horrifying that you just, oh my God, what is this? And I heard recently, I don't know if it's true, but I heard that the woman he lived with for many years, who ran him quite around the block, had been lovers with Aleister Crowley immediately before she went to Lovecraft. But I don't vouch for that. It could have just been someone's. It sounds like a spurious tale to me. Science fiction, for me, was as Carolyn said, my entry drug. I mean, before I got to pot, science fiction did it. And, you know, certain writers were stronger drugs than others. I mean, you must read Olaf Stapleton's The Star Maker. You must read A.E. Van Vo's The Weapon Shops of Ishtar. You must read Philip K. Dick, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. Brian Aldiss's The Long Afternoon of Earth. Walter F. Miller's A Canticle for Leibowitz. I mean, these things stretch your imagination, and then you begin to think, well, you know, alien life forms, things that come and get you in your dreams, magic which works, and the wonderful thing about science fiction is it's often worked out in the context of characters that are attempting to use rational analysis to come to terms with these things, you know. Mr. Spock being the paradigmatic figure. I mean, Mr. Spock is the kind of person you'd want to turn on to DMT because he could just say, well, Jim, fascinating, appears to affect the Alpha 1 logical modules and the, I don't know. So, you know, it's a funny thing. I mean, the bizarre, the outre, I think, I don't, for instance, like Stephen King and that kind of thing. My stuff has to be a little more Baroque and a little more artsy than that. But I am interested in the weird. And the weird is not all fuzzy and cuddly. I mean, you know, you got your Giegers out there and your Marquis de Sades and all that, although I read some of that recently and it's more silly than I would have thought. Catholicism is just such a strange thing. There's an amazing scene in the Philosophers of the Boudoir where this woman is assaulting her nephew while having homosexual sex with her sister-in-law, while hanging a goat, while doing something else. And in the center of this incredible scene of multiple perversity, she looks up from her work and points out to the abbey with the whip raised above her. She says, "And I am being a bad example." Which is just the icing on the cake. If you are not a bad example, what's the point, you know? Yeah.
In the work that I've done with Michael Horner and some others in Shamanic, one of the things that is often stressed is the crucial importance of the intention.
Mm-hmm.
The answers that you get, in a sense, come because of the intention you have from the start. In your work with psychedelics, does that seem to be an important thing? Do you work with that much, or is it more just, I'm going to go and see what happens?
No, I'm more a phenomenologist. I just say to it, I say, you know, please don't hurt me, and I'm yours. Thy will be done, whatever it is. I'm not leading anybody anywhere, and I'm not saying what it is, and I don't know what it is. My approach is basically scientific, and I say, here's something weird that we found in the woods. What is it? And it has adumbrations spiritual, adumbrations biological, adumbrations mathematical, adumbrations aesthetic, and so forth and so on. But I don't know what it is. All I know is it's the most interesting thing around. I once asked the mushroom why it had unloaded so much of its intentionality on myself and my brother, the old why me question. And it answered without hesitation. It said, because you don't believe anything. Because you don't believe anything.
You have no barrier to knowledge.
yeah, you have no expectation. You're not going to proclaim that it's the Virgin Mary or the Muse or people from the Pleiades or anything. You say, hell, I haven't a clue. I don't know what it is. It clearly is something which partakes of ourselves. In other words, a freaky thing about it is that as you approach it, it becomes more and more like a doppelganger. It clothes itself in you. And so when you finally are able to take it by its hand, you're just having a conversation with yourself. But then as you pull back, this otherness flows into it again. And some of the strangest trips I've had are the ones where at some point in the dialogue I will say to the thing, show me what you are for yourself. And it's like suddenly the cheerful trip about the end of the world and the time wave or whatever it is just halts. And it's like that enormous organ tone at the beginning of the Bach B minor Mass, you know, and it's like, and the curtains begin to rise, and I just begin to feel like I'm shrinking, and it's rising up, and it says, you know, you want to see the naked radiance of the unspeakable? Behold, O insect. And you say, oh God, you know, okay, good, enough of that, back to the show, please. And so, a friend of mine says every time he takes mushrooms, he says his goal, the goal of the trip, as he puts it, is to stand more. To stand more. Because as it begins to part the veil, at some point, you know, you cry uncle. But to the degree that you can persist and tolerate its Iskite, its beingness in and of itself, then that's the real basis for knowledge. But I really believe this thing that J.B.S. Haldane said, you know, the world is not only stranger than we suppose, it's stranger than we can suppose. So that's a lot of permission for supposing there.
I suppose that if your use of these plants was for the purpose of healing people that came to you, then that would change the way that you would probably approach them. For you, that's not the way you use them, so it's more...
No, I've never claimed to be a shaman, and when people lay that on me, what I say is no. You know, that's preposterous. I'm a shamanologist. I'm interested in the phenomenon of shamanism. But to presume to cure somebody, I mean, I can't imagine. No, I'm in the Whiteheadian tradition, actually an older tradition than that. You know, Francis Bacon, who I often say ugly things about because he had the wrong attitude toward nature, Francis Bacon said of nature, let us place her on the rack of rational inspection that we may wring from her secrets. Yes. That was but he also said, in the absence of a theory, simply collect facts. And that's where we're at with this psychedelic thing. We have no theory. Psychology is in its infancy. No psychology, no theory of human psychic functioning need be taken seriously at all. From neurolinguistic programmers to Jungians to Freudians to Adlerians they all 1/3 gets better, 1/3 get worse, 1/3 stay the same. These psychologies are no better than, you know, burning green candles and this sort of thing. So we don't have a science of human psychology. What we have then is the Baconian dilemma. We should simply collect facts. That's why I put so much stress into the groups that I talk to talking about the experience. This is what's really important. I mean, you know, pharmacology texts don't do that. I mean, they say compound F, created LSD-like hallucinations, hypnagogia, delusion of reference, period. Well, this delusion of reference was for somebody a life-changing struggle with some kind of god or demon. We want to hear more about this delusion of reference. What was the delusion of reference, and what was the resolution of this delusion, so forth and so on. It's in the details. Blake said, attend the minute particulars, that we can then build up some kind of picture of what this is. I have the strong intuition that it's historically important, that it's always been around. It is the basis of an ancient religion, the world's oldest religion. But it's going to have some kind of impact on our dilemma. We may, as a global culture, be sinking ever deeper and faster into the quicksand, but we are not sinking into the quicksand in a state of entire unconsciousness. Some people actually realize the depth of our dilemma. So that means that this isn't an absurd situation where the fool is crushed in the rock slide and never knows what struck. It's a tragedy, because there is the possibility of making a stand against the forces of extinction. There is a possibility of overcoming the dilemma, and yet whether or not we exercise and realize that possibility has, it seems to me, something to do with how fast the word is gotten out about the bankruptcy of the paradigm of rational materialism and positivism and so forth and so on. And the evidence is all around us. I mean, people believe it's so exotic that I basically prophesy the end of the world like somebody in a New Yorker cartoon. Well, but I've got news for you. The straightest people around prophesy the end of the world. They can see it coming. It's just for them it means the end of the petroleum, the end of any place to put the atomic power plant waste, the end of sexuality as we know it, so forth and so on. But the end of the world is on everybody's dance card, and you can have a psychedelic transcendental version of it, like I'm trying to put out, or you can have a Bosnia-Herzegovina version of it, which is where untrammeled rationalism and didactic scheming by politicians is going to take us. Just more ranting and raving. Anybody want to say anything? Yeah, Karen.
One of the things that I've been thinking about lately is trying to figure out a way to start a syncretic religion that would assist in this task of replacing organized paternalistic religion with a more syncretic, sort of pantheistic, earth-based, psychedelic, Dionysian, leaping around sort of thing that would be that we could get to make, to develop it, to start to develop something like that, and give it a position in our lives, and begin to spread it as a new way to deal with life issues. And I'd love it if I could get Terence to comment on an idea or two for starting something.
A new syncretic religion?
Yes.
Well, you could just say, "Fat man, give me that guitar." Sure. I'll do the plucking from here on out. No, I guess my best shot is the mushroom, and the reason really that Dennis and I published that book in the mid-70s was because I felt that if the mushroom were accessible, all else would follow. And in a sense it has, and in a sense it hasn't. I mean, more people should grow that mushroom, because it is the in my pantheon, it's the substance. It is, of all the allies the one that was with us on the long march across the grasslands and into Eden and out of Eden and so forth and so on. And it is also just totally bizarre that the mushroom speaks. I mean, even in the realm of psychedelics, this is extraordinary. Others, occasionally you can goad a squawk or two out of them, but the mushroom just rants and raves. You can't shut it up, you know. It won't take no for an answer. So I think bringing these cults of communal activity, communal intoxication, use of music, sexuality, sound, and psychedelics to break down social boundaries, to empower underclasses, and push it forward, that this is the best we can do, and you can just sort of choose where you want to be. Salvia has it has a potential. MDMA, drawbacks and potential. Psilocybin I like just because I think it appeals to the wiggier side of my personality. It also is an item of commerce. You know, it's rescued many a family from going on the welfare rolls and given them a life of honest toil in replacement to something else. Cannabis as well. And it fascinates me, you know, I believe that the issue around legalization is deeper than we all think, in that the reason that these drugs, which do not promote criminal syndicalism and do not, you know, we don't see people twitching in the gutters because of psilocybin or cannabis, the reason these things are so savagely suppressed is because consciously or unconsciously, the truth of my insight is sensed in the establishment. The insight that these things dissolve boundaries and are therefore psychosocial dynamite. And no society, I don't care whether it's run by Hasidic Jews or stockbrokers or Marxists or whoever it is, no society is going to unleash a substance or a practice that causes people to question the premises upon which the government is based. In that sense, these psychedelics are profoundly antisocial. In all times and all places, if you've got more of a society together than a bunch of people herding cattle around and having sex together at the new and full moon, then it's going to be eroded and it's going to be called into question by these things. That's why, you know, I wish that we could trick them, basically, into legalizing cannabis. Because I think removing that one tiny chink from the dike will let the oceans of noetic intentionality flow in, and it'll be to their eyebrows before they ever knew what hit them. But apparently they know this full well, and they're not going to be talked into legalizing weed on some lame argument about tax revenue or something like that when they realize that the whole society will disappear. The CIA chemist Sidney Cohen, who did their dirty work for them for years, made an amazing statement in like 1965. He said, "We must suppress LSD." He said, if the potential for LSD were ever understood by the public at large, our society would disappear overnight. You know, this was a CIA master chemist. He knew whereof he spoke. And that's why these things are so politically sensitive, because these are the pheromones that carry the central core messages of the assembly language that is holding Western civilization together. Right now, that message is hard work, monogamy, fidelity to capitalist values, and a maxed out credit card, and you know, and if you said no, you know, you don't need all this junk, and monogamy is a pain in the neck, and think about X, Y, and Z like this and this and this. They would say, oh my God, what are you doing? What are you proposing? What kind of madness is this? Well, it's the kind of madness we've lived too long without, you see. And so I think it's basically a struggle over social values, not easily won.
There's some amazing acid heads of long survival who do all of the above that you mentioned, including the maxed out.
Oh, you mean that have sold out?
Work hard every day, and are still wild psychedelic acid heads. One in particular used to get high or smoke grass before high-powered business meetings with all the Japanese executives and made vast fortunes.
Well, I have never, this is heresy, I know, but I have never embraced LSD as the answer. I think you're probably right, but I dare say I doubt there are too many psilocybin heads in that situation. You might be able to find one, sort of the Willie Hogan of psilocybinania, but I think that statistically speaking, I don't think the argument stands up. When you're dealing with human populations, there were people who used to, after a busy day of incinerating Jews, would go home and put their feet up and listen to Bach's choral preludes with full appreciation of them. Still, this is not a judgment on Bach, I think. So I think, generally speaking, psychedelics impel people toward a saner lifestyle. But the reason I prefer the plants is because I believe in the morphogenetic depth of the field that must surround a shamanic hallucinogen that's been used for thousands and thousands of years. Yeah.
Do you personally like San Pedro, and why don't you have more to say about it, especially being so ancient and all? I've never been very keen, I think it's just a personal thing, I've never been a very keen person on mescaline in any form. It is the one of these mainstream big psychedelics with a history of shamanic usage it's an amphetamine, not an indole. And I seem just to do better with the indoles. This very small category, DMT, LSD, the beta-carbolines, the ibogaine complex, the only exception that I feel personally impelled to make to sticking with that family is I'm tremendously partial to cannabis, which is a polyhydric alcohol. But I'm certainly willing to grant that San Pedro and mescaline, these are venerable chemicals, and mescaline was the first psychedelic to receive any amount of study. The use of peyote is not millennia old. People who imagine that it's been used for thousands and thousands of years, it hasn't. There's no evidence for that. What's found in the old graves in the peyote cultural area are the seeds of Sephora secundifolia, which is a hideously an ordeal plant, a toxin. The San Pedro complex in Peru, on the other hand, looks to be as old as any datable plant cult on the planet. So that's probably just a preference of mine. In a way, though, I do it because, there are thousands of altered states of all kinds, ranging from biliousness through the whole gamut of opiated states, all the tropane states, what do they call them? The ketamine states, the states of analgesia, and so forth and so on, states of hyperthermia, dream states, states of panic. But this indole family seems to me the most non-invasive. Also, the other thing I would say about mescaline that's beyond argument is one way to judge a compound's toxicity
is by how much you have to take to get off. And a real good hit of mescaline is 700 milligrams. That's a shitload of pure alkaloid. Psilocybin, 30 milligrams. 5-MeO-DMT, 15. DMT, 700 milligrams of a pure alkaloid is a little daunting, although, this wonderful needlepoint mescaline that some people made a few years ago definitely is welcome in my stash anytime. Yeah, Carolyn.
I heard you mention pheromones a minute ago, and that because one of the questions that I've been asking people that's come to mind over the last couple of days is why is it that LSD is so much more powerful quantitatively than all the other so-called psychedelics? In other words, the amount that you take that totally changes your life is infinitesimal. You really can't really see it with the naked eye. Barely. And perhaps it is a pheromone. Perhaps it is something that unlocks behavior rather than actually affects any chemistry anywhere. It's unlocking the behavior.
Well, I think this is a very interesting idea. Years and years ago, I studied tropical botany and geography from a guy in San Francisco named Ralph Adey. And I don't know where this guy was coming from, but he gave a lecture on the subject of hallucinogens as pheromones and had this concept all worked out circa 1973 that hallucinogens were what he called exopheromones. You see, a pheromone is usually a chemical released within the context of a species to regulate the individuals within that species, like in an anthill. He said we need a new word. The word should be exopheromone, and an exopheromone is a compound which carries information from one species to another. And in fact, this is the experience that we have on psilocybin. It's just that we can't believe that information could be so explicitly conveyed. But if this were true, it would be a very good way of regulating behavior. If you release just a few milligrams of moth pheromone, you can release moths up to 15 miles away who will immediately orient toward your pheromonal source and head toward it. Well, my God, the sensitivity of their olfactory system must be down to the level of picking up a few atoms, a few molecules of this stuff. Somebody said recently, if you want a picture of how powerful the activity of LSD is, imagine a single red ant ripping down the World Trade Center in a half an hour, and you have a picture of how effective LSD is at undoing the mammalian organism. I mean, it is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, we just don't know of drugs. In fact, probably only pheromones work at that level of concentration. Okay, gang, I think we better break this up. Thank you.
His temper's bad and he's a slob. He's bitter 'cause he lost his job. But my stepdad's not mean, he's just adjusting. So 3 cheers for the man that I proudly call Stan. He's not quite a dad or a brother, Yes, he gets cross, but still, he's the boss. And besides, he takes care of my mother. So be patient with new friends like Stan. It's tough to be mom's second man. But your stepdad's not mean, he's just adjusting. So remember, kids, a stepdad is a lot like a new puppy. They need patience and love while they adjust to their new surroundings. But remember, if he is ever abusive to you or mommy, what are the magic numbers? 9!